book today is The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America by Greg Grandin. And this is from Chapter 1, titled All That Space. The British colonies in North America were conceived in expansion. America was an aspiration, an errand, and an obligation born out of violent Christian schism and Europe's interminable religious and imperial conflicts. Depending on the intricacies of their particular interpretations of Revelation, the Protestants who settled New England might have understood flight across the Atlantic as a way of escaping European war, or they might have seen migration as a chance to open a new front and win those wars on a new soil. Here in the 1600s, in the eschatological nebula of the New World, was the first paradoxical image of America as simultaneously pristine and despoiled, empty and at the same time filled with primitives begging for deliverance, subordinated to Catholic Spain, which had conquered its part of the Americas a century earlier and stood as the great obstacle to Reformation England's rise as a world power. All yell and cry with one voice, Libertia, Libertia, Richard Hakluyt, a clergyman and court minister, wrote in the late 1500s, hoping to convince investors and his queen to establish an American colony. As Puritan society frayed under the harsh conditions of settler life, the frontier threatened and beckoned. The dark woods were filled with witches, and they were witchy, inviting hither. The forest was the place where the community could be redeemed and given new purpose, a chance to once again start anew, or it could be a place of more sorrows, wilderness sorrows, as two early Puritan patriarchs described the hardships that awaited those who ventured into uncharted territory, where whatever solidarity existed would be smashed into atoms as settlers scattered to escape the rule of the clergy. People are ready to run wild into the woods again and to be as heathenish as ever, warned Increase Mather. Expansions could be, often in the same sermon, held up as the cause of and the solution to the difficulties of establishing Christian communities. Either way, Native Americans had to get out of the way. They could die. They waste, they molder away, they disappear, said one Puritan chronicler of indigenous people who had succumbed to European pestilence years before the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, thus clearing the earth for the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. God made way for his people by removing the heathen and planting them in the ground, said another observer. They could be murdered. The holy terror unleashed by the Puritans was, according to the historian Bernard Bailyn, driven by fears of what could happen to civilized people in an unimaginable wilderness and fears of racial conflicts in which God's children were fated to struggle with pitiless agents of Satan, pagan antichrists swarming in the world around them. Survivors could be enslaved. The first patent granted in colonial America in 1626 was to a Virginia merchant and planter, William Claiborne, for inventing a device that would not just restrain Indians, but also make them work. Claiborne was given an Indian to experiment on for the trial of his invention. Colonial records do not say what this innovation might have been, only noting that it was not successful. Or they could be pushed further and further west. The prodigious and relentless population, complained New Orleans Spanish governor in 1794, progressively drives the Indian nations before them and upon us, seeking to possess for itself this vast continent which the Indians occupy between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Appalachian Mountains. More than a century and a half later, writing in the early 1950s, the Mexican author and diplomat Octavio Paz made much the same point. America was, he writes, if anything, geography, pure space, open to human action. Since it lacked historical substance, ancient social classes, established institutions, religions, and hereditary laws, reality presented no obstacles other than natural ones. Men struggled not against history, but against nature. And wherever there was an historical obstacle, indigenous societies say, it was simply erased from history, reduced to a mere natural fact and dispensed with accordingly. Evil is outside, part of the natural world, like Indians, rivers, mountains, and other obstacles that must be domesticated or destroyed. End of quote. The American Revolution is a permanent revolution, Paz went on, a nonstop expulsion of, quote, all elements foreign to the American essence, and a constant invention of itself. And anything that stands in the way of that invention, anything that is in any way irreducible or inassimilable assimilable to perpetual creation, be it Native American, Spanish America, or history itself, quote, is not American. Quote, in other places, the future is one of man's attributes because we are men. We have a future. In Saxon America, the process is inverted and the future determines the man. We are men because we are the future, and everything that has no future is not a man. End of quote. The United States, Paz said, offers no room for contradictions, ambiguity, or conflict. The nation flies forward swiftly as if weightless across the land, trying to stop North Americans moving west. Stephen Austin, the founder of Texas, said over a century earlier.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, another crazy day in Washington, D.C. The House just gavelled itself back into order. And there's all kinds of speculation about what's going to happen today. Is it going to be Fred Upton as Speaker of the House? Are they going to adjourn for a day so Kevin can get his act together? You know, is Hakeem Jeffries going to get elected because enough Republicans decide to vote present so that theoretically Kevin could hit, you know, a threshold he would need? But, you know, if the Democratic Party all holds together, he doesn't. Not only does Kevin not hit that, but suddenly Hakeem Jeffries is our Speaker of the House. Nobody knows. And so I will keep you absolutely up to date on what's going on. You know, we will be monitoring this, and we'll see what happens. The story, and by the way, the House was just gavelled into order by Louisiana Democratic Representative Cheryl Johnson, who is the clerk of the House. She is now the first black woman to run the House of Representatives. And, you know, this you know, another one of Nancy Pelosi's brilliant choices. And she's done just a marvelous job and completely snark-free. I couldn't have done that, you know. I don't think I could have. I could have without, you know, an occasional comment. Particularly in some of the nomination speeches, you know, yes, I nominate Kevin McCarthy. He's such a good guy. He has such integrity. Really? So, you know, there's all these different theories about what might happen. That if the Democratic caucus cut a deal with some of there's about 40 members, Republican members of the House who are members of their own kind of moderates caucus. It's informal. But there's about 40 of them. And, you know, might they work something out? I don't think so. My sense of it, and I could be wrong, but my sense of it is that the Democrats are just going to, you know, leave this to the Republicans. You know, they've got the majority. They've got to work this out. And in doing so, Kevin McCarthy is faced with a whole bunch of seriously bad possibilities as long as he's got now 20. It was 18 when we started the day yesterday. Actually, it was 6 when we started the day yesterday. But he's up to 20 people who have voted no on him. And, you know, we'll see how it shakes out. The whole Fred Upton thing started actually with an article in Politico. And this was, I don't know, about a couple of days ago, maybe a week ago. The Politico reported that Fred Upton had, he's the Republican congressman from Michigan. He's been a member of the House of Representatives for 34 years. He's retired. He retired, and he is going back to Michigan. He's no longer in the House, but you don't have to be a member of the House to be a Speaker of the House. And he's broadly respected across the Republican caucus. He's kind of an old-fashioned, so-called moderate Republican. You know, of course, you know, he wants to privatize Social Security and end Medicare and you know, stop unemployment benefits, all the things that Republicans want, but. He doesn't want to end democracy in America. I guess that's the defining line, right? What's a radical? What's a moderate Republican? A moderate Republican is a Republican who doesn't want to end democracy. Although, you know, what's so shocking is that they're becoming fewer and fewer between. So yesterday, the Detroit News kind of surprised the world when they tracked Fred Upton down and said, "Hey, you know, are you taking this seriously?" And he said, "Yeah, I'd do it." And suddenly it became a thing. I frankly don't think there's any chance of that happening. what it looks like to me, and again, I could be wrong on this. It's really hard to predict exactly what Republicans are going to do in the House of Representatives. But what it looks like is going to happen to me is that McCarthy's either going to cut a deal. He's going to give these guys enough, frankly, power is what they want. He's going to give them enough power, committee chairmanships and stuff like that, and commitments to bring certain pieces of legislation to the floor. He's either going to give them enough power that they're going to vote for him, or he's going to give up. And then there's going to be option number two. Back in, what was the year? I think it might have been 1999. Denny Hastert, remember him? The disgraced former wrestling coach, kind of a Jim Jordan story, who went back to Ohio and was accused of sexual behavior, inappropriate sexual behavior, with some of his wrestling youth. But anyhow, Denny Hastert was like number 5 or 6 or 7 or something like that in Republican leadership, and they couldn't come up with a speaker, and they ended up putting Denny Hastert forward as kind of the guy. So if they can't do it with Kevin McCarthy, who's next? Well, the number 2 person is Steve Scalise. The number 3 person is Elise Stefanik. And Steve Scalise, I tweeted this yesterday, with a link to an article from Breitbart from a few years back, where Steve Scalise was bragging when he was running for the House in Louisiana. He's a congressman from Louisiana. He's probably best known for being the guy who got shot by the crazy, when they were playing baseball, by the crazy Bernie supporter, but who was apparently, whatever. But it's, his claim to fame is that he didn't run as, but he bragged that he was David Duke without the baggage. So that's your number 2 option. Your number 3 option would be Elise Stefanik. The New York Times on Sunday, I believe it was, did a fascinating, maybe it was Saturday, did a fascinating deep dive into Louise Stefanik's backstory. And, she's comes from a wealthy family. She's Harvard-educated lawyer, all this kind of stuff. And she started out as the millennial who's going to do good things in the House and ended up as a crackpot. She's a Trump humper. And one of the most bizarre varieties, and apparently has no core values at all, which is perfect for the Republican Party. So will it be her? I doubt it, but, I'm not laying my bets on anything. Kevin McCarthy is, smiling a lot right now on the TV machine, so we'll see what happens. We got a lot to talk about today. Of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, on this whole circus, shall we say. A word I can't say on the radio keeps popping into my mind. What's going on in the House right now? But this whole circus, and how it's going to play out, and what this is going to mean. I mean, for example, and I think I mentioned this briefly yesterday, if they can't even come up with a speaker, how are they going to raise the debt ceiling? And if they don't raise the debt ceiling, the country goes into default. And the last time that happened was 2011 during the Obama presidency. And it so damaged our economy that it took almost 2 years to recover from it. And there are pundits and commentators who argue, and I think cogently, that decision to hold the country hostage in 2011 by the Republicans in the House of Representatives was the thing that paved the way for Donald Trump. So anyhow, there's that. There's also my rant today, which I'll get to on the other side of this break, is the right to contraception about to end in America. You probably don't realize that right now, teenagers in Texas can no longer get free advice or birth control if they're under 18. And I mean, this is step 1. First they came for abortion, now they're coming for birth control. This is the result of an effort. Well, I'll tell you all about it in a minute. In the second hour of our program, Professor Richard Wolff is going to drop by. What's the future of Bitcoin? Is there a role for alternative money? What is money anyway? We'll get into that with Professor Wolff, an economist. And also the January 6th summary. What did Trump know and when did he lie about it? Well, I just want to give you, Timothy Snyder has a great summary of this. I want to share parts of it with you. In the third hour, the very thoughtful op-ed in the New York Times about Putin's red lines and how America should be running our cooperation with Ukraine in this war in Ukraine, or this terrorist attack against Ukraine by Russia. And also, I mentioned this briefly yesterday and went looking for the actual quote last night, found it, and I wanted to share it with you today. Pete Buttigieg, I believe, is essentially declaring an end to neoliberalism. So we'll see how all these things play out. But we'll get to all that. Also, some of the links from the right-wing media. I've got to share some of these with you too. They're just crazy. The writing newsletter out this morning. So that's everything happening on my end, or at least how our show is going to be today. We will continue with the program in just a moment. It's 16 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann program.
This is the Thom Hartmann program.
Fair and only slightly unbalanced. We'll be right back. And welcome back, Kurt in Akron, Ohio. You have the straight scoop on Denny Hastert. I got something wrong there?
Yes, what happened was, and I don't mean to defy you in any way, shape, or form.
Please feel free. Whenever I don't get it right, I love it when people can fix it. So yeah, tell us the story.
Okay, well I'll try not to sound like a smart mouth when I tell you the story.
It's okay to be.
Okay. What happened was, if you remember, in 1998, after that midterm election, Newt Gingrich resigned his speakership.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So then what happened was, in that lame duck session, that's when they did the Clinton impeachment for the obstruction of justice, lying under oath, all that other stuff.
Right.
And Bob Livingston was Gingrich's heir apparent to the speakership.
Yep.
So then, on the day that Bill Clinton was impeached by the House, Bob Livingston got up on the floor of the House and withdrew his nomination for Speaker because he admitted to doing the exact same thing that Bill Clinton had just been impeached for.
Oh, that's right. He was another one of the guys who'd been having an affair. Him and Bob Barr and Gingrich. Yeah. Okay. So
then that's when Denny Hastert came along and took over to become the next speaker in 1999. It's because Gingrich resigned because he was being disgraced, and Livingston got shamed because of Larry Flint's little.
That's right. Larry Flint outed him. Thank you for the trip down memory lane, Kurt. And then?
Exactly. And like I told your screener, I said, I know that specifically because at the time, my mom and dad were actually finishing their basement, okay? And my dad made my brother and me put things on Sharpie, take a Sharpie and write on the inside walls before they put the new walls up, anything we wanted. And it was the day of the Clinton impeachment. And I remember writing the date of December 18th, 1998, Bob Livingston is a crook.
Okay. Kurt, thank you. Thank you very much. I truly appreciate it. Okay, good talking to you. Dennis in Aptos, California. Hey, Dennis, what's on your mind?
Well, the lack of gerrymandering by California and New York so that the Democrats could have kept the House. That's what's on my mind.
Yeah.
And I'm having, I've lived in California my whole life. And I know from time to time Republicans have howled and screamed, oh, there's gerrymandering here in California. And then, somebody like Newsom or Brown, they try to appease them and, make the districts more fair. Yeah. We don't need to make them more fair. And I'm going to tell you why. They don't make them more fair in Ohio, Wisconsin, Florida, Texas,
Michigan,
North Carolina or South Carolina, where the state Supreme Court said the gerrymandering must stop. And they went ahead and did it anyway.
Yeah.
So that's why we're in the fix we're in. I'm blaming Newsom and Hochul, is that her name, over in New York?
Yeah.
They decided to do with what Michelle Obama says, fly high.
Right.
I'm against flying high. We have to get down in the gutter with the Republicans and fight fire with fire, or mud with mud, whatever metaphor you want to use. Because if you don't,
in California, it's law now. I mean, and this was the result of a ballot initiative, if I'm remembering correctly.
I voted no on it.
Yeah, there's nothing you can do about that. In New York, however, it's a matter of policy. I'm pretty sure. So there, I'm with you. And, you know, there's a reckoning, I think, going on in New York. Also, Kathy Hochul's apparently supporting some right-wing wackadoodle for the head of their Supreme Court. This has got a lot of people going, huh? Dennis, thanks for the call. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So Congressman Joe Walsh was on CNN the other day talking about the liberal media bias. And you know, he's a former Republican. I mean, I think they actually believe this stuff. And I don't know how they can believe it when they know. I mean, Joe Walsh, of all people, would know that there are 1,500, more or less, right-wing radio stations in America and a handful of progressive radio stations. For example, Twitter's own internal study found that in 6 out of 7 nations, the exception being Germany, tweets from right-wing politicians received more amplification from the algorithm than those from the left. And right-leaning news organizations were more amplified than those on the left. That's a quote from their own study. The Media Matters did a study. 8.8% of Sunday show guests are liberal. 48.5% tilt to the right. Tell me about this again. There's a whole video about this over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. So my op-ed today over at hartmannreport.com is titled, "Is the Right to Contraception About to End in America?" And here's the story in a nutshell. The lawyer who was, one of the people who helped write the Texas legislation, what was it? What would you call it? The abortion vigilante legislation. The lawyer who helped write that has now launched a lawsuit against the Title 10 in the state of Texas. Just to step into the Wayback Machine for a minute. Back in the 1970s, back in 1970, in fact, the second year of the Nixon administration, Richard Nixon signed into law Title 10, and one of the provisions of Title 10 is a grant, a block grant program where the federal government sends money to individual states, and the states then hire a contractor, basically, within that state to administer the money. And in the state of Texas, it's an organization called Everybody Lives, or Everybody's Lives, excuse me. And and then they distribute the money. It's going out to, as I recall, like 150 some odd, hang on just a minute, I've got it in my article, 150 some odd, 156 clinics through 32 agencies. And that money is used to provide confidential contraception to people of all ages, including people of any age. There's no age limit on this. And so, although the reality is that they won't serve people under 15, but generally speaking. But the lawsuit was by a father of 2 daughters who didn't want his daughters to have access to contraception, and he didn't want them to be able to walk into a free clinic paid for through Title 10 money and get the contraceptives without his knowing about it. And so, he's the guy on whose behalf this lawyer sued. And guess what? They found a lawyer in Texas, or excuse me, a judge in Texas, a federal judge, a federal district judge. He was appointed by Donald Trump in 2019, who said, yeah, you're right. These teenage kids, they should not be able to get contraceptives. And so and this kind of slipped by everybody's radar screen because it happened the week of Christmas. It happened a week ago. And it is now illegal in Texas to use Title X money to provide contraceptives to teenagers. And you can bet, you know, this is, by the way, this is going to go to, it's being appealed, and it'll go to the Fifth Circuit Court, which is the court, you know, from Texas halfway over toward Florida. It's one of the more conservative courts in the country. And it's going to go to the Fifth Circuit Court, where it will be probably, they'll probably agree with it. And if they do, then it'll be appealed again, and it'll go to the Supreme Court. And you got 6 wackadoodles on the Supreme Court right now. So, I mean, there's only one major institution in the United States that's opposed to birth control altogether, and that's the Catholic Church. That said, there are a fair number of people who are opposed to birth control. There's a psychologist, Dr. Marty Klein, who wrote a piece about this for Psychology Today a few years back, and he said there's basically 4 reasons why people are opposed to birth control. Fundamentalist religions fear sexual pleasure, which birth control facilitates. Contraception effectively limits family size, empowering women. Contraception promotes personal autonomy, making women more likely to challenge male authority. And birth control may make abortion more acceptable to society. And so here we are. It has begun. You know, to paraphrase Pastor Niemöller, first they came for our abortion rights, now they're coming for our birth control rights. And this is just the first step. So, you know, expect to see more of this as this proceeds. But I just wanted to flag this and put it on your radar screen. I am convinced most Americans have no idea that a federal court last week ruled that teenagers can't have access to contraception paid for with Title X money in Texas. We'll be right back. It's 27 minutes past the hour. Pick up your phone calls. See how we're going.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And they're still going through the nominating process right now in the House. Everybody's giving speeches. I'll keep you up to date on how that's traveling, too. Our book today is The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America by Greg Grandin. And this is from Chapter 1, titled All That Space. The British colonies in North America were conceived in expansion. America was an aspiration, an errand, and an obligation born out of violent Christian schism and Europe's interminable religious and imperial conflicts. Depending on the intricacies of their particular interpretations of Revelation, the Protestants who settled New England might have understood flight across the Atlantic as a way of escaping European war, or they might have seen migration as a chance to open a new front and win those wars on a new soil. Here in the 1600s, in the eschatological nebula of the New World, was the first paradoxical image of America as simultaneously pristine and despoiled, empty and at the same time filled with primitives begging for deliverance, subordinated to Catholic Spain, which had conquered its part of the Americas a century earlier and stood as the great obstacle to Reformation England's rise as a world power. All yell and cry with one voice, Libertia, Libertia, Richard Hakluyt, a clergyman and court minister, wrote in the late 1500s, hoping to convince investors and his queen to establish an American colony. As Puritan society frayed under the harsh conditions of settler life, the frontier threatened and beckoned. The dark woods were filled with witches, and they were witchy, inviting hither. The forest was the place where the community could be redeemed and given new purpose, a chance to once again start anew, or it could be a place of more sorrows, wilderness sorrows, as 2 early Puritan patriarchs described the hardships that awaited those who ventured into uncharted territory, where whatever solidarity existed would be smashed into atoms as settlers scattered to escape the rule of the clergy. People are ready to run wild into the woods again and to be as heathenish as ever, warned Increase Mather. Expansions could be, often in the same sermon, held up as the cause of and the solution to the difficulties of establishing Christian communities. Either way, Native Americans had to get out of the way. They could die, They waste, they molder away, they disappear, said one Puritan chronicler of indigenous people who had succumbed to European pestilence years before the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620, thus clearing the earth for the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. God made way for his people by removing the heathen and planting them in the ground, said another observer. They could be murdered. The holy terror unleashed by the Puritans was, according to the historian Bernard Bailyn, driven by fears of what could happen to civilized people in an unimaginable wilderness and fears of racial conflicts in which God's children were fated to struggle with pitiless agents of Satan, pagan antichrist swarming in the world around them. Survivors could be enslaved. The first patent granted in colonial America in 1626 was to a Virginia merchant and planter, William Claiborne, for inventing a device that would not just restrain Indians, but also make them work. Claiborne was given an Indian to experiment on for the trial of his invention. Colonial records do not say what this innovation might have been, only noting that it was not successful. Or they could be pushed further and further west. The prodigious and relentless population, complained New Orleans Spanish governor in 1794, progressively drives the Indian nations before them and upon us, seeking to possess for itself this vast continent which the Indians occupy between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Appalachian Mountains. More than a century and a half later, writing in the early 1950s, the Mexican author and diplomat Octavio Paz made much the same point. America was, he writes, if anything, geography, pure space, open to human action. Since it lacked historical substance, ancient social classes, established institutions, religions, and hereditary laws, reality presented no obstacles other than natural ones. Men struggled not against history, but against nature. And wherever there was an historical obstacle, indigenous societies say, it was simply erased from history, reduced to a mere natural fact and dispensed with accordingly. Evil is outside, part of the natural world, like Indians, rivers, mountains, and other obstacles that must be domesticated or destroyed. End of quote. The American Revolution is a permanent revolution, Paz went on, a nonstop expulsion of, quote, all elements foreign to the American essence and a constant invention of itself. And anything that stands in the way of that invention, anything that is in any way irreducible or inassimilable to perpetual creation, be it Native American, Spanish America, or history itself, quote, is not American. Quote, in other places, the future is one of man's attributes because we are men. We have a future. In Saxon America, the process is inverted and the future determines the man. We are men because we are the future, and everything that has no future is not a man. End of quote. The United States, Paz said, offers no room for contradictions, ambiguity, or conflict. The nation flies forward swiftly, as if weightless across the land. Trying to stop North Americans moving west, Stephen Austin, the founder of Texas, said over a century earlier, was like trying to stop the Mississippi with a dam of straw. The drive west waxed and waned and burst forward with great passion during key moments. The book, The Edge of the Myth, by Greg Grandin.
Share the Thom Hartmann program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann program. Welcome back. Well, the voting has begun, and Congressman Chip Roy got up and nominated. You know, they've got to have an anti-Kevin candidate. Right, you've got Kevin McCarthy, and of course the Democrats are nominating Hakeem Jeffries every single time over and over again, and who is, you know, now the leader of the Democratic caucus in the House, the House Minority Leader, and so apparently what they did was they looked around and said, we need a Herschel Walker. What was it that Trump said? There's my black guy. Who is their black guy? Where's our black guy? And it turns out that there is a black Republican in the House. His name is Byron Donalds. He's a Republican from Florida. And so Chip Roy got up and said, you know, I'm nominating Byron Donalds. Now, of course, they have no desire to have Byron Donalds as their Speaker of the House, but Chip Roy nonetheless said, for the first time in history, there have been 2 black Americans nominated for Speaker of the House. Because, you know, Hakeem Jeffries is black also. So the voting is going on, and so far Donalds has 4 votes. If he gets 1 more vote, McCarthy is screwed. If he gets 2, McCarthy's dead. I mean, or toast, or whatever. So, you know, we'll see how this plays out. It's getting interesting. Also, I said I wanted to share with you the right-wing media over at Truth Social. Donald Trump. McCarthy will do a good job. Some really good conversations took place last night, and now it's time for all our great Republican House members to vote for Kevin and close the deal. Well, we'll see. I mean, it might happen. Might happen. We will know probably within about 10 minutes, and like I said, I'll keep you up to date. The New York Post, their headline today, House GOP must stop this madness and go after Biden. How about that? Instead of being a check on the White House and the Democrat-controlled Senate and using its investigative power to probe Biden and his family's corrupt business deals, the chaos suggests too many Republicans are freelancing and engaging in a fool's errand, masquerading as an act of principle. All right, PJ Media. The new Republican House majority is a driverless clown car. Whoa. Whoa. Yeah, Nate says that's his vote. Yes, the best headline of the day. American Thinker, the headline, Kevin McCarthy becomes a squatter. Man, these people are struggling. They are really struggling. Oh, yeah. Oh, 6? Donald's just got 6 votes? Okay, well, there you go. That's it. Kevin McCarthy goes down in flames again. Okay, picking up your calls here. Gordon in Reddington, California. Hey, Gordon, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hi, Tom. Well, listen, I'm pretty much shaking in my boots and my heart's pounding because I think what's happening in the House trying to elect or vote in a speaker is kind of a kabuki theater for them saying, well, we can't get anybody in the House to be speaker, so let's then someone's going to nominate Trump. And I think Putin is masterminding this, and it's scaring the hell out of me.
Yeah, I don't think Putin is masterminding it. If you're looking for anybody who is the puppet master here, it's probably a small group of right-wing, mostly fossil fuel billionaires who just don't believe that our government should do anything other than run the army and the police and the courts. And, you know, these so-called libertarian billionaires. And, you know, they pour enormous amounts of money into the coffers of these hardcore right-wingers. These are the people who echo back in 1980 when David Koch ran for vice president on the libertarian ticket on a platform of ending all public schools, privatizing all our public roads, turning them into toll roads owned by, you know, corporations, privatizing Social Security, ending Medicare, ending unemployment insurance, ending the child labor laws. I mean, I could go through the list. It's a long one. But that is where I think the real puppet master lies. I don't think Putin is behind it. Putin's got a lot on his, you know, we're going to talk about that in some depth in the third hour today. He's got a lot on his plate right now. And he's really struggling.
But the Republicans that went to Moscow on the 4th of July, and who's the other guy that was the general that was the national security advisor?
Mike Flynn.
Yeah, I mean, they're all in line with him. Mm-hmm. They want to be like him. They want a dictatorship.
Yeah, although those were all, with one exception, there was one member of the House in that delegation. All the rest of them were senators. That was you know, Ron Johnson was on that trip, and I don't recall the whole list, but I do recall that they were all senators, so Republican senators, of course. But so you know, Putin's doing a lot of nasty stuff around the world in his troll factories and farms and whatnot. I don't think this is at the top of that list. But I share your concern, Gordon. And let me put this in a larger frame. And I mentioned this yesterday. I think it bears repeating. What this tells us is that when it comes time to govern, to do rational, reasonable things like raise the debt ceiling so that the government can continue to operate, pass a budget, that just basic stuff, that this Republican majority probably will not be able to do it. And, it's probably going to fall to the Democrats to be the ones who pick up the pieces. I mean, we'll see how it plays out, but the enormous damage that happened to this country back in 2011, the last time that the Republicans pulled this little stunt, I don't think any of us, I mean, the Republicans want to see that repeated, but I certainly don't want to see it repeated. So anyhow, I got to move along. Gordon, thank you for the call. It's nice to hear from you. Thank you for watching us on Free Speech TV. Brad in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, with listening to WCPT. Hey, Brad, what's up?
Hey, you mentioned a couple of things. Denny Hastert, he was out of Illinois, like Yorkville, that Aurora area.
Oh, that's right. I said Ohio, didn't I? I was wrong.
Right. And Henry Hyde, which was out of the northwest suburbs, he was one of the ones leading the Clinton charge for the Republicans, and he had an affair that was in his background that everybody in Chicago knew about at the time, the late 90s. The final thing I want to say is you had your comment about Elise Stefanik and these Republicans that have no core values, and just a little bit of humor here. I would call them silly putty. Do you remember how silly putty used to pick up comic images?
Yep.
And I just think a perfect name for them is silly putty.
It becomes what you want. That we're kind of dating ourselves here, Brad, with that. But I don't know whatever happened to silly putty. Maybe it had some chemical in it that wasn't good for you or something, or maybe it's still around. I haven't.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking my call.
My pleasure, Brad. Good talking to you. Thank you. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind this morning?
Oh, happy New Year, Tom.
Back at you.
Well, yeah, sure. The first thing that struck me was the report was that Kevin McCarthy ordered 7,000 pizzas to the Capitol last night, and I just thought, if all 435 members of Congress even brought 5 staff members, that's enough pizza for everybody to have 3 of their own. I mean,
it wasn't literally 7,000 pizzas.
And no beer. That's the other problem. That's why nobody can get along there. Pizza and no beer.
How can you have pizza without beer? Or at least a good red wine. I'm with you.
Here's the thing, Tom, and you alluded to it yesterday when you commented on the NPR reporter commentary that said that America has voted for divided government so that there would be debate. And that is absolute nonsense crap.
Yep.
The reason this is happening, and maybe this is the self-limiting aspect of gerrymandering and sort of our proxy parts of our government, like, the electoral colleges, Trump never won, not by the people's standard, and the Republicans never won. Millions more people voted for Democrats in Congress than Republicans, and if it's solely for the fact of gerrymandered districts, that they have this razor-thin majority, and the fact is they don't have any – the whole gerrymandering thing has allowed them to get away with having majorities without having to actually be accountable to their constituencies to do anything.
That's right.
They're not arguing about anything other than power. This is the old Roman, succession of leader. They don't have any policies, and frankly, I almost don't think that many of their constituents, certainly not the Trump constituents, could even tell you what kind of policies they support. The only thing I keep hearing is to stop the Democrats from their radical agenda.
Right.
It's stop something. It's not do something.
Burn more
stop
books.
Something.
Burn more books.
Yeah, burn more books. Stop the Democrats from and yet they can't even tell you what it is that they're trying to stop. And I think the Matt Gaetz and these 20 holdouts or whatever, they just want to keep the culture wars going because they know that's the only, and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, that's the bread and butter that they live on. Right. And it's starting to stink. It's just, that's why they can't, that's why they're in this position and it's kind of self-limiting, in the same way like food poisoning is self-limiting. If it doesn't kill you in its when you initially get it, you'll get over it. And this is maybe kind of the fact that gerrymandering, when you don't have to actually produce anything, eventually it has a shelf life that the only thing it will lead to is this power struggle that's for nothing but power and dominance. And
but
that's where they start fighting at each other, and that's
but this has been the case. This has been the case for literally the entire conscious lifetime of Gen Zers. I mean, you know, the last president to win an election the last Republican president to win an election based on the popular vote was George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988. I mean, that was 34 years ago, 35 years ago now. So it's
and by the way, can you even think of a Republican Speaker of the House who was effective? I mean, ever since the contract on America, Newt Gingrich went down in flames. Everybody since Newt Gingrich, when they started pursuing their radicalized agenda to divide America, they may have gotten some power with their propagandizing, and but there hasn't been a Tip O'Neill in the Republican ranks for I don't know how long. Yeah,
for long enough that for millennials and Zoomers, they're just unaware of it altogether. Yeah, I'm with you. Paul, thank you very much for the call, and Happy New Year's. I appreciate the well wishes. We'll be right back. It's 46 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Speaking the truths the transnational corporations would really rather you didn't know all about. We'll be right back with your calls. And welcome back. Mark in Long Beach, California. Hey, Mark, what's on your mind today?
Mr. Hartmann, thank you for taking my call, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you too, Mark.
Thank you. I just want to make 2 points, if I could. Mm-hmm. I just want to ask you your opinion. First, I want to mention how this fiasco can end, real quick-like.
Okay.
And I'm dying to hear your opinion.
Okay.
The Democrats currently have 213 members. All it takes is 5 moderate Republicans, mainly from the East Coast or the West, not from the South, and just tell the Republican congressman, we've had it. This is how it's going to end. You either put Kevin McCarthy in, or us 5 moderate Republicans are going to vote for Hakeem Jeffries, and he will have 218 votes, and that's it. Issue is settled. I bet you it would end in 10 minutes.
Oh, you're absolutely
right.
No, your math and the dynamics of it that you're describing are 100% right. It will not happen, though, and the reason why is can be summarized in just by naming names: Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Fred Upton. I mean, any Republican who voted to impeach Donald Trump, and there was 10 of them, they all lost their seats. Maybe one of them held on to his seat, but I think all the rest of them lost their seats. I think the exact same thing would happen. If any Republican were to line up with the Democrats and vote for Hakeem Jeffries, it would probably be the end of their political career.
Now, the second thing I wanted to ask you, and I'm dying to get your opinion on this, I want you to tell me and your audience if it would have been very, very devastating for America or if it would have been a good idea. There was a senator from Oregon. He was a Republican. His name was Mark Hatfield. And I'm sure you remember him since you live in Oregon. In 1995, his was the deciding vote because they needed 67 senators, and he was 66, for a balanced budget amendment. Had he voted yes, we would have had a balanced budget amendment.
Maybe.
Would that have been crippling or devastating for the country of America?
Yes, it would have been, and it's designed to be, by the way. This is something that has been pushed by these right-wing libertarian billionaires for years and years. And, once again, they don't believe that the government should do anything other than field the military, the courts, and the police. And, but it just because it passed the Senate, it would have passed the Senate, doesn't mean that it would have become an amendment to the Constitution. It still has to have the approval of 3/4 of the states. You have to have 2/3 of the House and Senate and 3/4 of the states to amend the Constitution. So it's a pretty high bar, but they keep talking about it. I mean, you know, you're going to hear talk. In fact, I would bet almost anything that in the next 2 years, you know, as Republicans control the House, they will pass another balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, and it won't go anywhere. I mean, you know, everybody knows how destructive it could be. So.
Oh, okay. Do you remember that, Senator Mark Hatfield?
Yeah, you know, I didn't live in Oregon in 1995, but I was aware of Mark Hatfield. He was a fairly high-profile guy, both for some of the good stuff that he did, and he was, as I recall, an environmentalist. Maybe I'm wrong. You know, Sean is like, meh.
I only asked you because he took a lot of heat from the Republicans for voting no.
Yeah, he also was involved in some sort of a scandal that had to do with hitting on a staffer or something. I don't know. That was a long time ago.
Oh, no, that was Bob Packwood.
Oh, that was Bob Packwood. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Mark, thank you for that. Okay. So my Oregon history, I've only lived here for 14, 15 years. Mark, thanks for the call. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, or one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio, and tag you're it. Welcome back. 51 minutes past the hour and picking up your calls. By the way, Hakeem Jeffries is up to 97 votes, Kevin McCarthy at 100. And Congressman Donalds has 12 votes. So, you know, Kevin is on his path to come up with another 20 people who hate him or oppose him or whatever. We'll see how it plays out, but it's getting weird. It's getting very, very weird. Paul in Ambler, Pennsylvania. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind today?
Happy New Year, Tom. Good to see you back.
Thank you. Back at you.
I think that you're going to be amazed in light of the last caller of what the possibilities are in Washington, D.C. In Pennsylvania, we have a legislature that's enormous. It has about 200-plus members, and that's just the lower house. Mm-hmm. And if you ever came to Pennsylvania and saw the Pennsylvania state legislature, you would have thought you were in the Vatican. They have crystal chandeliers the size of parachutes illuminating the hall. It's beyond belief. At any rate, yesterday, the same day as the U.S. Congress was supposed to elect the leader, the Speaker of the House, and was supposed to install the newly elected representatives, something happened. The Democrats in Pennsylvania won a majority of the seats in the election. Unfortunately, two of the people, one went on to Congress, Summer Lee, she was from Pittsburgh. She's sort of like the AOC of Pittsburgh. And then another one, the other guy, became a lieutenant governor. So it put them one vote below the threshold of having a majority. But this would only be temporary. They would have a special election. But the Republicans would just come in and elect their own because they had the majority, and that would be that. They would hold power for whatever, 2-3 months, some very short-term amount of time, and then everything would revert back to the Democrats being in control, which was a historic moment for the first time in decades. Mm-hmm. Now, yesterday, the Republican gets up, and he announces for nomination a Democrat. The Democrat gets up and announces he's leaving the Democratic Party and going to be an independent because this partisanship is just not what I'm here to do.
Mm-hmm. Was this a Democrat who was kind of a...
Machiavelli is alive and well and living in Harrisburg.
Right.
Then the leadership of the Democrats and the Republicans applauding the new nonpartisan independent Speaker of the House, throw all their weight behind him. All the Democrats and a good block of the Republicans vote him into power.
Right.
Freezing out the Republicans for even 1 minute of power.
Wow.
One can even...
Was this guy kind of a was this guy kind of a Joe Manchin Democrat? Is that why the Republicans went with him?
I don't really know who he is. He's like the biggest nobody of all time, as far as I know. Pennsylvania has players, and you see them in the news all the time.
Yeah.
Every time there's a budget hassle, every time there's a problem, every time there's a book burn, or whatever that crap is that they come up with, it's the same guys over and over and over again.
Yeah.
They're the usual suspects. This guy was so nondescript, so out of left field. No one even knew what was going on until it was over, and even then, everyone was scratching their heads. No one has ever seen anything like this.
Interesting.
Ever.
Yeah. Well, I believe actually, Paul, Pennsylvania is one of 2 states where that happened. Something similar to that happened. Basically, a consensus candidate took over in a very, very tightly split House. Forgive me for not remembering the other state. I just caught it in a news story last night. They flew by, but I noted Pennsylvania.
You know that if there were enough Republicans with their heads screwed on straight, that they would have been able to do this. But I hear you about Liz Cheney and other people. I don't think that they want to do anything other than have a scorched earth policy on the Republican Party, because then they can come in as the savior, put order to chaos. I think that they would like to have
you're talking about?
Well, there's other Republicans who have been sitting in the background. People very similar to Liz Cheney from the national security establishment. People that are very tightly tied to various corporate.
Yeah. I see this. Yeah, I see this as the guys who are dancing to the tune of the right-wing billionaires. Now, we had a caller earlier who was saying maybe Putin was behind this because if the Republicans take over the House, they're going to cut off aid to Ukraine. Who knows?
If Putin was behind this, he would do a better job in the Ukraine than I think. I don't think Putin.
That was my point. I think he's got more on his plate than we realize. Paul, I got to run, but thank you very much for the call and thought-provoking conversation. We will continue. Professor Richard Wolff is going to drop by. We're going to talk about money and Bitcoin. Kevin McCarthy has officially lost this 4th vote, so the 5th vote will probably be a half hour or so from now. We'll continue our gawking at this bizarre clown show.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily takeeveryday.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcast of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcast normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. Check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com. Today we're reading from Behold America by Sarah Churchwell, The Entangled History of America First and the American Dream. This is from the prologue.
On Monday, 30 May 1927, a cool day with showers forecast, New Yorkers were gathering for the annual Memorial Day parades around the city. It was only 9 years since the end of the European War, into which America had been so reluctantly drawn, and Europe had suddenly become closer than ever before. Precisely 10 days earlier, Charles Lindbergh had completed the first solo flight across the Atlantic in the spirit of St. Louis, and no one had yet stopped celebrating. Front pages around the country reported that Lucky Lindy had been mobbed in London, greeted by rapturous crowds of 150,000. Few Americans were talking about much else than the newest national hero, but in New York that day, different kinds of mobs were about to gather. Around 8 a.m., a group of Italian immigrants living in the Bronx set out for the elevated train on their way to Manhattan to join the parade. But they were not going to honor the American soldiers who had died in the service of their country. They were supporters of Mussolini, planning to join 400 American fascists who were marching in Manhattan's Memorial Day parade as part of the official fascist movement in the United States. They had been invited by the parade's organizers, to the outrage of many anti-fascists, including Italian nationalists and anarchists who threatened violence if the invitation wasn't rescinded. It wasn't. Like all his fellow fascists intending to march that day, Joseph Carisi was wearing the black shirt uniform, sporting leather boots, jodhpurs, a black cap, and carrying a steel-tipped riding crop. When he stopped to buy a newspaper, Carisi was jumped by two men, stabbed in the neck, and left to die on the sidewalk. Another fascist, Nicholas Amoroso, who was running either to catch up with his group or away from the killers, reports vary, was shot 4 times, once right through the heart. One of the 2 murdered men had served in the American Army during the Great War, the other with the Italian Army, papers reported. The parade they had meant to join took place without them, a fascist delegation of several hundred that was guarded by police to, quote, avert disorder. After the parade, the American blackshirts returned to their headquarters in the heart of Times Square. There, another of the fascists standing outside was set upon by 3 men. He defended himself with his riding crop as his fellow blackshirts charged out, brandishing clubs and whips, chasing the assailant through the theater traffic in Times Square, who fled as the black-shirted mob tore through the traffic. 100 fascists, reported the New York Times, rushed the attackers. A melee ensued that was quickly dispersed by the police. There was also violence in Brooklyn, where a parade of fascisti marched from the Angelo Rizza Fascista League at 274 Troutman Street in Bushwick. The LA Times reported several hundred men were parading, including 40 or 50 in the black shirt uniform. Fights broke out between supporters and protesters mingling on the sidewalks, and an anti-fascist was found lying on the ground, stabbed in the back. He survived and identified a fascist as his assailant. Accompanied by 30 police reserves to forestall violence, the marchers made their way through Brooklyn, stopping at the Wilson Avenue station, where the fascisti came to attention and gave the fascist salute. They ended at a Roman Catholic church, where the priest blessed them under large American and Italian flags, while the police remained on guard. The biggest outbreak of violence that Memorial Day, however, occurred in Queens, where it centered around a different right-wing group, not Italian Americans, but the self-proclaimed 100% American kind. By 1927, the Ku Klux Klan had spread across the United States since its rebirth in Georgia 12 years earlier. The first Klan was formed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, as former Confederate soldiers in Tennessee created a secret society to promote white supremacism, and terrorize the newly freed slaves in the South during the Reconstruction era. The name is generally believed to have originated from the Greek word for circle, kuklos, while Klan pays homage to the mystified Celtic heritage supposedly shared by white Southerners. Within a decade or two, the first Klan had been successfully suppressed by law enforcement and died out by the turn of the century. But in 1915, it was resuscitated in Georgia, and by the early 1920s, the second Klan had achieved a powerful political presence in the United States, not only in the South, but across the country. I would add this is because of 1915, the movie Birth of a Nation came out. The Klan had an active presence in New York City and Long Island by 1927, with favorite slogans, which they even attempted to copyright at various points. That year, the Klan was calling attention to the fact that it first announced the program of 100% Americanism and of America First. They were not, in fact, the first to adopt these mottos, as this book will show. In 1927, both phrases had been around for a decade or more. But as far as the Klan busily copywriting hate was concerned, America First belonged to them. And on Memorial Day in Queens, 1,000 or so of them had gathered to march, many in white robes and hoods. They were accompanied by 400 women from the so-called Clavana, the feminine branch of the Klan. Some of the reported 20,000 spectators in Queens that day objected to the Klan's presence as others defended their right to march. Scuffles broke out, and it turned into a riot. Women fought women, and spectators fought the policemen and the Klansmen as their desire dictated, said a newspaper. Klan banners were shredded, and 5 of their number were arrested, said initial reports, while a few others were caught up in the confusion as well. The book, Behold America, Sarah Churchwell.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. So yesterday was the 14th birthday of Bitcoin, the very first of the cryptocurrencies. It was first mined on January 3rd, 2009 by Satoshi Nakamoto. He created the Bitcoin, the first Bitcoin block on that date. Some of the early real-world transaction, the main one, the first one that occurred was in 2010 when a fellow by the name of Laszlo Hanziek purchased 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin. That would be $167 million in today's Bitcoin money. But, you know, you find the Bitcoin community celebrating this on Twitter on May 22nd. They call it Bitcoin Pizza Day. The Bitcoin reached a $1 value in February of 2011. In 2013, it crossed $1,000 per token, and the all-time high was last year at $69,000. El Salvador and the Central African Republic have both made Bitcoin official currency. And some months ago, maybe half a year ago or so, Professor Richard Wolff and I had a conversation about Bitcoin on this program, and we were both broadly, I think, of the opinion that it was A, a bubble, and B, a commodity and not a currency, if I'm saying that right. But let's check back with him and see what his thoughts are on what is the future of Bitcoin. Is there a role for alternative money? And also, what is money? Professor Richard Wolff is the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books, including his most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself, also available now as an ebook. And he hosts The Economic Update with Professor Richard Wolff right here on Free Speech TV. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program. I'm wondering if you could just, you know, share with us your thoughts on Bitcoin. I mean, exactly what you were predicting seems to have come to pass with the great crash of Bitcoin.
I don't much believe in predictions, so I'm not going to dwell on that or pat myself or even you on the back. It didn't take a great deal of insight to understand that the conditions making for these kinds of cryptocurrencies are the conditions that will make it extremely volatile, extremely risky. I would only assert for the people listening and watching your program not to get drawn in unless they really understand the enormity of the risk they're taking. Bitcoin's value has collapsed in double-digit percentages. It's a very wobbly item. The story you mentioned and many others are full of predictions for the next year, which run the gamut from making much more money than it did in the past to making even less money than it did in the past, and everything in between. Here's what I think is going on. In capitalism as a system, every kind of business that has ever been invented has been, sooner or later, abusively manipulated, whether it's banks or farming or manufacture or services. That's why we're full of commissions in the United States. Once upon a time, you could run a taxi service, but then there were crooks who abused it and didn't use safe vehicles and didn't insure what they did. And so we have a commission in virtually every city governing the taxis. And the commission works it out so it's safe by having a price that covers the costs of safety. And what happens sooner or later is a couple of hustlers come in and try to substitute, without the commission, a similar product. These days we call them Lyft and Uber. They come in, run a taxi service in effect, without the rules, make a lot of money, then a lot of bad things happen, and now they have to be regulated. Money is no different. Money is something that we used to, when we first started as a nation, let banks do. But they were crooked in many cases. You couldn't rely on the money. You couldn't be sure who issued it or who would honor it if you tried to cash it in. So we had the government come in, either with a commission or the Bank of the United States, eventually now the Federal Reserve, the controller of the currency, in order to make it reliable. Money will always generate people who try to get around the rules, make a lot of money for a short while, and then teach us why we put rules in effect in the first place. And now guess what? Federal Reserve, central banks around the world are getting in on fiat, on this kind of money. Cryptocurrencies are being issued by central banks. They're going to control it. They're going to limit it. And given the volatility and how many people lost money, you're building the public support for exactly that kind of control. But I guess there will always be people who want to get around it, come up with some novel technology to do that, promise us the world of freedom from control, and then demonstrate to us why we've always gone back to that control, because the so-called freedom from it is too costly for too many of us.
That's a brilliant analysis, which raises the question, is Bitcoin a currency or a commodity? I mean, it seems to me like it's more of a commodity than outside of El Salvador and this Central African Republic. How do we define these two things? I suppose you could, make the same argument about gold.
Exactly. I was about to say, what you're doing by your question, Tom, is actually recapitulating the history of what we're talking about. Money initially was a commodity. That's why it was gold and silver. It was indeed a commodity that had other uses besides being money. Gold was a process in manufacturing. Gold was a kind of jewelry. Silver, same thing, and yet other silver used to be important in processing photo activities and so forth. So the line between commodity and money is a very subjective question of historical moment. At a point, it's a commodity. At another point, it's money. And at another point, it's both of those things, trying to navigate the passage from one to the other. Even to this day, gold is mined not only because it's a monetary item, but also because in parts of the world, it's a very important commodity in the jewelry business, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're always struggling to get a boundary, sort of, between commodity and money. But because money is so important and we're so worried about it being abused in one way or another, because it always has been, we want to have a backup, something we can be more sure about than the money, and particularly these days, the money is represented by a piece of paper. So we want something solid behind it. Gold, silver, or some other commodity has to play that kind of role. So I don't think we'll ever escape from that ambiguity. And as long as we have capitalism, we're not going to escape from the endless process of controlling, managing, having the government come in, then trying to escape, then discovering we can't. After a certain point, we kind of ought to ask ourselves the question, is there something wrong with the system that puts us in this repetitive cycle over and over again, especially when gullible people can lose their entire life savings somewhere in the process?
Right, which also brings up the question, how can a commodity exist without existence? I mean, gold you can hold in your hand, right? You can buy, shares of gold electronically and things like that. But by and large, there's always gold at the end of the, even the people who are selling ETFs for gold, exchange traded funds for gold, are, you know, they've got gold in their basement, basically, and they're saying you're buying a piece of this gold. With Bitcoin, what you're buying are zeros and ones. It is an intangible tangible, and yet it can be converted into real things in the real world. How, you know, what are your thoughts on that and on the safety of that and on the future of that?
Well, let me push back a little bit. I don't think there's anywhere near as big a difference as most people do. In the end, yeah, it's a matter of faith. Do you believe in the piece of paper that says Federal Reserve note on it, like our currency does here in this country? Do you believe the Bitcoin receipt you have when you invested there? It's not that different from what's the value of gold. It has to do with people's attitudes. If people decide that gold isn't all that beautiful and that something else is more beautiful, the demand for gold will disappear, or at least it'll shrink a great deal, and that will destroy its value. People have been disappointed by the disappearing value of things they could touch and feel and smell and see in their hands almost as much as they have with money. So I think in the end, it's a kind of a reminder lesson that the economy, like so much else in our lives, is not the hard and fast and fixed and under control reality we might wish it to be. It is, in fact, very conditional on the politics, the ideology, the history, the culture we live in, and we maybe ought to pay more attention to that as being what in the end determines value than attaching ourselves to something as if it had a value no matter what.
Brilliant. Professor Richard Wolff, I so appreciate you dropping by. Always learn something from you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you.
And check out Professor Wolff's TV program. He's the host of Economic Update with Professor Richard Wolff over on Free Speech TV, freespeech.org on the internet if you want to check it out. We will continue our conversations about, you know, what's going on with the Republicans in the House and others in just a moment.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Also, January 6th, the summary. What did Trump know and when did he lie about it? Well, I'll share that with you on the other side of the break. And welcome back, Rick in Temecula, California. Hey, Rick, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Hey, I wanted to just shoot you a note that actually George W. Bush also won the popular vote.
In 2004, not in 2000.
2004.
Yeah.
Yeah, just barely.
Right, but he wouldn't have been eligible for that, or he wouldn't have been, you know, the guy running for that, had he not been handed the White House in 2000 by the Supreme Court.
Oh, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Not only that, but it almost happened where he won the popular vote, but could have lost the electoral vote. And if that had happened, then the Republicans would have called for the end of the Electoral College.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, Rick. If the circumstances were reversed, you know, if Al Gore, if George Bush had won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College in 2000, for example, and Al Gore was made president with a minority of the popular vote, the Republicans would never let us forget it. And Democrats, I think, this is, you know, people talk about Democratic messaging as if it's like, you know, we need to come up with some slick way to say this or that. I don't think that's the case. I think that, you know, we need to be pointing out, we need to be going to the mat on some of these real issues, on these, you know, issues that are really worth fighting for. Rick, thank you. Thanks for the call.
One quick thing.
Yeah.
I'm a hearing deficit, and is there any way possible to get closed captioning on your TV show?
That would be something to take up with Free Speech TV. That's not something that we do on this end. That's something the networks do, I believe. If it was to originate with us, I don't even know where to begin with that. So I'm sorry, but check with Free Speech TV. Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot for the call, Rick. Vicky in Garden Grove, California. Hey, Vicky, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I wanted to ask you about AARP. My husband wants to join it. But I was afraid that would put us automatically in Medicare Advantage, and I know I don't want that. What I've listened about you, that wouldn't get me into Medicare Advantage, would it?
No, No, they make most of their money off Medicare Advantage. And so if you join AARP, you will be relentlessly pestered to buy their products.
I see. Okay.
But they've got a lot of, one of the things they have to do in order to get and maintain their membership is offer other things, to offer discounts and advice columns and create kind of a little community of retired people and all that sort of thing. And they've done a reasonably good job of that. I've never joined AARP on principle because I'm just offended by, them being basically the sellers of insurance and pretending to be something other than that. But if I wasn't, drawing a line in the sand because of that principle, as it were, if I was less political, there's probably no real downside to joining AARP. And there may, and I'm sure there's an upside to it. It's been a long time since they've pestered me. I haven't heard from them in probably a decade. So,
I'm just so afraid of getting into that Medicare Advantage. I don't want to, but I appreciate your show. I watch it every day. Thank you so much. And you are the best on the radio. Thank you so much,
Vicki.
Tom.
Thanks a lot for the call. It's great to hear from you. And a Happy New Year. It's 21 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. I'll fill you in on where the House leadership vote is going, the House speakership vote is going, and also let's have a conversation about January 6th right after this. Stick with it. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Did you know that Americans have elected 8 animals to political office? I realize all politicians are animals, and arguably all humans are animals, but these are non-human animals who have been elected to political office. It's absolutely fascinating. There's Stubbs the cat, who was the mayor of Talkeetna, Alaska. Most of them, by the way, have been elected mayors. Clay Henry the goat, he was the mayor of Lajitas, Texas. Max the dog was the mayor of Idlewild, California. In Milton, Washington, they didn't go for the mayor. They got a committee person, a committeeman. That's Boston Curtis the mule. And Boscow the dog became the mayor of Sunol, California. Jinx the cat, this is one of the very best. Jinx the cat was the mayor of Hell, Michigan. Isn't it nice to get away from politics every now and then, or sort of? Lincoln the goat was the mayor of Fairhaven, Vermont, and there was even a rhinoceros who was on the Sao Paulo City Council. The whole list is over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. So January 6th, the facts. One of the things that we have learned as a consequence of the January 6th commission is the depth and breadth of this conspiracy to take down a democracy in the United States and replace it with an autocratic form of government, with one-man rule, with Donald Trump as dictator, and how close we came to that. I mean, it was 5 or 6 Republicans in various states. Brad Raffensperger in Georgia. There was a county commissioner, as I recall, it was his position in Michigan, in one of the counties around Detroit. There was a couple of people in Arizona, the Speaker of the House in Arizona, Rusty Bowers. Just a handful of Republicans who stood up to Donald Trump and prevented him from becoming America's first official dictator, which is pretty breathtaking when you think about it. Timothy Snyder, over the holiday weekend, summarized January 6th, the facts. And I thought it was just a great summary and wanted to share with you, his summary of what we have learned. I think he's done a really good job of this. You can find his stuff, his writings over at snyder.substack.com. First of all, one of the things that we've learned is that Donald Trump knew well before the November 3rd election that he was going to lose that election. All the polling was showing that. The internal polling was showing that. The Republican Party polling was showing that. And his own campaign polling was showing that he was going to lose. So he knew that he was going to lose, which is why he started saying in public leading up to this is even before the election, that if he lost, it would be because of fraud, that would be the only way he could lose. In other words, he was planning this thing. Now, one of the things Tim Snyder doesn't mention, and that, to the best of my knowledge, is not in the January 6th report, was that this was the second time he had done this. In 2016, Roger Stone put together a website and trademarked Stop the Steal, and had a website, stopthesteal.com, as I recall. And they were planning, when Hillary Clinton won the election, on claiming that she had won the election by stealing it. And Trump was going to set himself up as president in exile, and it was going to be a whole, great new fundraising scam, and et cetera. And they didn't pull the trigger on this thing because Clinton didn't win. So that was number one. Number two, on the election day, now keep in mind, the election wasn't called for several days because all the votes take time to count in many states. But on election day itself, Trump, again, knowing he was going to lose, declared victory, which is just like wrong. I mean, you don't do that, right? Then in November, throughout the month of November, throughout the month of December, and throughout the month of January, and he started leading up to January 6th, Trump started making specific claims about election fraud. Oh, it was Ruby down in Georgia, and et cetera, like this. When he discovered that his campaign advisors, the people, his campaign officials, even the members of his cabinet knew that he had lost fair and square, he started promoting people like Rudy Giuliani who would lie for him in public. He made several deliberate efforts to overturn the election results and thus American democracy. In states that he lost, he had pressured Republican officials to change the election results and alter the outcome of the election. When Bill Barr and the Department of Justice investigated Trump's claims of fraud, they came back and said there's no evidence whatsoever. So Trump tried to use his power via Jeffrey Clark. He wanted Jeffrey Clark to write letters to state Republican officials saying, looks like you've got fraud in your state. Maybe you shouldn't certify the election. He oversaw an effort to create a slate of fake electors. Then, of course, he tried to get Mike Pence murdered. And, when Pence wouldn't go along with this scheme, when the Capitol was under attack, he actually called for more violence in a tweet halfway through that. And a bunch of Republicans sought pardons.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann program. Call 202-808-9925.
Those pardons pretty much demonstrating that they knew that what they were doing was a crime. 27 minutes past the hour.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Ezra Klein's new book, Why We're Polarized. This is from the introduction, and it's a couple pages into it. I'm starting out here. I have found that American politics is best understood by braiding two forms of knowledge that are often left separate: the direct, on-the-ground insights shared by politicians, activists, government officials, and other subjects of my reporting, and the more systemic analyses conducted by political scientists, sociologists, historians, and others with the time, methods, and expertise to study American politics at scale. On their own, political actors often ignore the incentives shaping their decisions, and academic researchers miss the human motivations that drive political decision-making. Together, however, they shine bright light on how and why American politics works the way it does. There's much awry in American politics, and I won't in this book attempt to catalog all of it. But I've come to believe the master story, the one that drives almost all divides and most fundamentally shapes the behavior of participants, is the logic of polarization. That logic, put simply, is this: to appeal to a more polarized public, political institutions and political actors behave in more polarized ways. As political institutions and actors become more polarized, they further polarize the public. This sets off a feedback cycle. To appeal to a yet more polarized public, institutions must polarize further. When faced with yet more polarized institutions, the public polarizes further, and so on. Understanding that we exist in relationship with our political institutions, that they are changed by us and we are changed by them, is the key to this story. We don't just use politics for our own ends. Politics uses us for its own ends. There are many different types of polarization possible, and I'll discuss some of them later in the book, but the locus of polarization I'll discuss is on political identity. And that requires saying a few words about a term that should be very useful in American politics, but that has become almost useless: identity politics. A core argument of this book is that everyone engaged in American politics is engaged in identity politics. This is not an insult, and it's not controversial. We form and fold identities constantly, naturally. Identity is present in politics in the way gravity, evolution, or cognition is present in politics. That is to say, it is omnipresent in politics because it is omnipresent in us. There is no way to read the literature on how humans form and protect their personal and group identities, literature I will survey in this book, and believe that any of us is immune. It runs so deep in our psyches, so activated so easily by even weak cues and distant threats, that it is impossible to speak seriously about how we engage with one another without discussing how our identities shape that engagement. Unfortunately, the term identity politics has been weaponized. It is most often used by speakers to describe politics as practiced by members of historically marginalized groups. If you're black and you're worried about police brutality, that's identity politics. If you're a woman and you're worried about the male-female pay gap, that's identity politics. But if you're a rural gun owner decrying universal background checks as tyranny, or a billionaire CEO complaining that high tax rates demonize success, or a Christian insisting on nativity scenes in public squares, well, that's just good old-fashioned politics. With a quick sleight of hand, identity becomes something that only marginalized groups have. The term identity politics in this usage obscures rather than illuminates. It's used to diminish and discredit the concerns of weaker groups by making them look self-interested. Special pleading in order to clear the agenda for the concerns of stronger groups, which are framed as more rational, proper topics for normal political debate. But in wielding identity as a blade, we have lost it as a lens, blinding ourselves in a bid for political advantage. We're left searching in vain for what we refuse to allow ourselves to see. All politics is influenced by identity. Those identities are most powerful when they are so pervasive as to be either invisible or uncontroversial. American is an identity. So too is Christian. When politicians, including the irreligious, end speeches with "God bless America," it's not because they're making an appeal to a higher power, but because they're making an appeal to our bedrock identities. If you don't believe me, ask yourself why there are so few open atheists or even agnostics in national politics. This does not mean that politics is an equation solved by locating identity. Identity shapes our worldview, but it does not mechanistically decide it. And while we often speak of identity as a singular, it is always a dizzying plural. We have countless identities, some of them in active conflict with each other, others lying dormant until activated by threat or fortune. Much that happens in political campaigns is best understood as a struggle over which identities voters will inhabit come election day. Will they feel like workers exploited by their bosses, or heartlanders dismissed by coastal elites? Will they vote as patriotic traditionalists offended by NFL players who kneel during the national anthem, or as parents worried about the climate their children will inhabit? What we are often fighting over in American politics is group identity and status. Fights that express themselves in debates over policy and power, but cannot be truly reconciled by either. Health policy is positive sum, but identity conflict is zero sum. The book Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein.
Welcome back. So just to give you an update on what's going on in the House of Representatives, there was, remember this whole conversation about whether there would be a present vote or whether enough Republicans would vote president that McCarthy could get elected with 212 votes instead of 218, or now he's, I don't know, he's lost 20. It would be 200 and it would be 196 or 198, right? If I'm doing my math right in my head, which I'm very bad at. So, but in any case, it's Kevin McCarthy. Apparently, now this is the Hill reporting. So I think that, a skeptical view is not inappropriate. But the Hill just tweeted, and I quote, "Just in, Kevin McCarthy has begun talks with Democrats about a deal to support a consensus candidate for Speaker or hold out from voting to ensure he needs to reach a lower threshold." Well, this is interesting. So, first, I mentioned yesterday that I thought that this might be where this ends up. That first he goes to the right-wingers and says, "What do you want?" And they say A, B, C, and D. And he says, "Okay, cool, here you are, A, B, C, and D, and vote for me." And then they vote, and they don't vote for him. And he goes back and he says, "What do I gave you A, B, C, and D. What else do you want?" They go, "We want E and F." And so he says, "Okay, you can have E and F." And then they have another vote, and they still don't vote for him. And at some point, he's going to say, "Screw these guys." There's 20 people who are obstructing him in his path, and he's given them the moon. And in fact, there's some speculation that Matt Gaetz has something to do with all this, which is very strange. But so now Kevin McCarthy goes to the Democrats, and this is where it gets real interesting. McCarthy sits down with Hakeem Jeffries and says, "What do you want? What would it take for you guys?" Now, you don't have to vote. Democrats don't have to vote for McCarthy. All they have to do is not vote, or vote present rather than voting yes or no. And it doesn't take a large number of them. It would only take 15 or 20 of them. And so, will that happen? Is Kevin McCarthy going to say, "Listen, I promise that I won't blow up the debt ceiling. I promise I'll be a good boy"? I don't know. I'm very skeptical. So we'll see. We'll see. By the way, there was one present vote. This was Representative Spars, Republican from Indiana. She voted present. She had previously been voting for McCarthy. And the 20th vote was Keith Self from Texas, Republican from Texas. So that's what's going on, and I'll keep you up to date on this as time continues. Right now, the question is, what's McCarthy going to do? He just lost again by 20 votes. And where does he go from here? All right, let's pick up your calls. Nathan in Rice Lake, Wisconsin. Hey, Nathan, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, I just wanted to comment on the difference between money and currency, like with Bitcoin. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but the way you can tell if it's actual money is 100 years later, you're still going to be able to spend a gold coin, but you're not going to be able to spend like a Confederate bill at a store. So
well, the Confederacy no longer exists, but you can't. I defy you to find a store, Nathan, that will accept a gold coin in exchange for anything, unless it's a U.S. currency gold coin. Is that what you meant?
Yeah. No.
In which case, I mean, any, but even then, I mean, if you walk in with a gold, a double eagle that, had, when it was issued, had a value of $1, and you walk into a store and say, this is what is it, about a quarter ounce of gold? So, this is worth $400. I'd like to buy $400 worth of clothes. They'll say, I'll give you $1 worth of clothes for it.
They won't even give you that. People will stand outside of a pawn shop. Yeah, these guys will stand outside of a pawn shop with a 1 ounce gold piece, asking if someone would give them $100 for it. And people look at it and they don't. People aren't educated about the difference between money and currency in this country, and all currencies eventually go to zero. And if you want to there's a guy on YouTube, Mike Maloney. He's a libertarian like I used to be before I discovered IE America 20 years ago, but started listening to you and totally changed my mind on progressive taxation and stuff like that. But he's really good at describing currency versus money, and he goes through the whole history of currency and how they've all failed once they detach from something of value like gold, and that's what the American dollar will do.
Well, they tend to detach. They fail when they detach from the country when the country itself fails. I mean, that's
like Zimbabwe
or the Confederacy. I mean, you know, they just Zimbabwe was kind of an exception to all those things. Zimbabwe, you know, Robert Mugabe with his agricultural reforms produced a massive famine that produced a shortage of an essential good. And much like the Arab oil embargo in the 1970s and 73 here in the United States, jacked up the price of gasoline so high that the value of our currency went down. We had inflation. When the price of an essential commodity goes up, relative to that, the currency will deflate. And that's what happened with the Zimbabwe dollar, I think it is that, you know, because food became so critical, people were willing to pay anything for food. And so you had this massive inflation. But that, you know, that wasn't, even if the Zimbabwe dollar had been backed by gold, I don't think that would have changed the equation there. And that's the thing. I mean, I think you can accurately say that when governments go away, their currency goes away. That fiat currency is always backed by the full faith and credit of the government that issues it, period.
Yeah, until it's gone, yeah.
Right,
so that's why the difference between money and currency is money will always maintain, you'll always be able to trade a can of food for it. But the thing with crypto and Bitcoin is the first thing that came along that was crowdsourced in terms of its value. Right. The crowd determined how much they would pay for it instead of the Federal Reserve or some central bank. And so Bitcoin's not going to go away as long as the internet's here. You know, if we have some Carrington event or something like that, then everyone loses. But until that happens, Bitcoin.
I think the main reason it's going to stick around, Nathan, is because it's increasingly being used for illegal transactions. It's used for human trafficking. It's used for drug trades. It's being used for international weapons trades. You know, and it's less traceable than currencies that have to clear through banks. And a whole lot easier than hauling suitcases full of $100 bills around the world. So you know, that's its principal value right now.
Yeah, but a lot of banking can be like that. But I think if you look at the situation in developing countries where people are unbanked, if they can buy a piece of Bitcoin and trade and use it on their phone, then it allows them to have a medium of exchange that they don't have to carry around like a half a fish.
Yeah, but in a country that is unbanked, it's unlikely you're going to have the average person on their little cell phone, you know, living on $3 a day, buying a $10,000 Bitcoin.
Right. No, you can buy any fraction of Bitcoin you want. It's just a medium of exchange that people are determining the value of. And I think if, you know, there is some illicit drug activity, but it's like don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
So it's like a fiat currency
concept.
It's only instead of being guaranteed by a government, it's guaranteed by there being sufficient demand for it. And like I said, I think most of that demand is being created by black markets.
Yeah, but Secret History of Money on YouTube, Mike Maloney.
I'm familiar with the arguments. I've been listening to them and reading them all the way back to the 70s when Howard Ruff I used to subscribe to his newsletter, The Ruff Times, and he would go off on this. He's long gone now, but yeah, I get it. Nathan, I got to move along, but thank you for the call.
All right. Thank you.
Fascinating conversation. Mark in Los Angeles. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Yeah, hi, Tom. Would this work if the Democrats went to McCarthy and said, we will make you speaker if you give us the Voting Rights Act? And to get a guarantee of some kind, and also what is that rule that the Congress can make that the Supreme Court can't rule on this?
Right. Invoke Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution. Yeah. You know, boy, that would be fascinating. I mean, you know, the Voting Rights Act was held up by...
it would take care of gerrymandering and electoral college.
Oh, yeah, H.R. 1, yeah. It was killed in the Senate by every single Republican plus Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. So this time around, one of those two would have to give in if it made it out of the House. But I suspect that if Jeffries or whoever he designates in Democratic leadership is actually engaging in good faith negotiations with Kevin McCarthy over his becoming speaker, that what they're going to be interested in is not going to be specific pieces of legislation. It's going to be more process than product oriented. It's going to be, things like we will not hold up, we will not suspend the government. We will not, that the Republicans will not fight lifting the debt ceiling or paying the national debt, those kinds of things. But we'll see. We'll see. I think your points are well taken, Mark. Mark, thanks a lot for the call. Bob in Farnham, Virginia. Hey, Bob, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Just a happy thought. You had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Wolff there, Professor Wolff. It was just fascinating. And he talked about how society went from something of value that they could hold as their world currency to an intangible, something of extreme value, but it was kind of intangible to most people. The perfect bit, if mankind or society is willing to accept the concept of a Bitcoin, all we have to do is convince everyone that love and compassion is the ultimate Bitcoin. Boom, we're done.
But the problem is it can't be traded or exchanged or whatever the word is.
I know. But just fanciful thinking.
Yeah, it's sweet, Bob. I appreciate that. We need more love and affection and concern and empathy and compassion in this world. And frankly,
more serious.
Go ahead.
On a more serious level, world compassion and cooperation is our path forward.
There you go.
Time to think.
Amen. Thank you, Bob.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
It's 46 minutes past the hour. Where are the Republicans going to go next? We'll be right back. And welcome back. And let me see here. Chaz in Lakewood, Washington. Hey, Chaz, what's on your mind?
Feliz Año Nuevo, mi hermano.
Okay, what is that?
Feliz Año Nuevo. Happy New Year.
Oh, Feliz Año Nuevo. Oh, okay, Spanish. I got it. Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah, for a change, I gave you a straightforward language instead of a dead language.
And one I actually studied in school for 2 years, although it was elementary school, so I don't remember much of it. But yeah, thank you. So what's up, Chaz?
Sticking to the Spanish. Real quick, if I wanted to interview you on the occasion of your 20th anniversary, who should I go through for that?
You should contact probably Sean or Louise. They pretty much handle my schedule.
Rock and roll. Let's get on to the topic of crypto.
Okay.
All right. It's been my experience as a user, and hopefully I will give you the positives and negatives of cryptocurrency, because I'll be honest, man, I made $1,700, then lost like $3,000, $5,000, I don't know, because I'm still putting money into it. The deal is that the crypto seems to be, in my experience, tied to the market. So it's probably going to get a little bit lower, but then I'm expecting that it's going to improve. I don't have hardly anything in it right now, but I am also aware that by the time it actually improves, there may be a question of regulation. Now, regulation could be bad because it could dampen the velocity of the crypto, but it could also be good because it could dampen the velocity of the crypto.
Right.
Finally,
increase its credibility. Let me just toss one other thing here in, Chaz, before you do your finally, and that is the supply-demand situation. I don't know if you've been following the news, but there are people all over the world who are finding cheap sources of electricity. And in one case, there was actually a coal-fired power plant that was here in the United States that was only kept online because the guy who bought it wanted to use its electricity to mine crypto. And so there are these massive operations, these massive crypto mining operations that are happening all around the world. And they have to be supplying just a huge load of cryptocurrency into the marketplace. And you know, if it's a commodity as much as it's a currency, like gold, it's, you know, I mean, you know, new gold mines come online, you see gold prices go down. The Chinese New Year happens, and you see, you know, and everybody wants gold as a gift. It's a kind of a traditional thing in China, and the price of gold goes up because the amount in circulation goes down. So I'm wondering, you know, it doesn't look to me like these crypto mining operations are shutting down any day soon. It looks to me like, if anything, more and more of them are coming online, and that would argue that over time the price of crypto is going to continue to decline.
I've seen it both ways, but recently I've been led to believe that a lot of crypto places have curtailed because energy is not the only consideration. Obviously, you've got to have mechanisms. You've got to have computers that are generating these Bitcoin. And the problem is that in addition to energy, obviously, it takes a lot of processor power. And a lot of people are finding out they're barely making a difference. So, yeah, you've got to have hundreds. My final is that when a 128-bit computer comes out, then we might have a different story.
Oh, because it'll produce them so much faster, you mean?
It might be easier to crack, and I hate to say that because my finances are on the line.
Oh, to crack the to crack the blockchain. Yeah, I get it. Okay, yep. Chaz, thank you. A fascinating conversation. We'll be right back. 51 minutes past the hour. Share the Thom Hartmann program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann program. You know, Donald Trump wasn't such a terrible president other than inciting an insurrection against the government, mismanaging a pandemic that killed 1 million Americans, separating children from their families and then selling them off into foster care where they literally vanished, tear gassing protesters in Lafayette Square. He had the worst jobs record of any president in modern history. He tried to blackmail a foreign country to get dirt on his opponent. He fired the FBI director for investigating his ties to Russia and Putin. He took Vladimir Putin's word over U.S. intelligence. He caused the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. He lied nearly 30,000 times. He vetoed a defense funding bill because it renamed military bases away from Confederate generals. He increased the national debt by $8 trillion. He had 3 of the highest annual deficits in U.S. history. Well, the list goes on. There's actually over 250 things on this list, and about 2/3 of it is on a video over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. 52 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Picking up your calls. Briscoe in Houston, Texas. Hey, Briscoe, what's on your mind today?
Okay, there's an article in the Houston paper this morning that the reason the defectors from McCarthy, the principal thing in their mind is the deficit. I wanted to know what your analysis is of what effect the deficit still has on the economy in this day and time. I know all about defaulting on the the effect default would have, but I'm really just talking about like the difference between $1 trillion deficit and a $500 billion deficit, and budget. I mean, what? Because if they're really serious about forcing the deficit to be cut by, say, half a $1 trillion, that's going to be a serious thing. I mean, what effect would that have?
Yeah, the deficit is now substantial. I think our national debt is well over $20 trillion. The deficit is the annual difference between what we take in and what we spend, and the debt is the cumulative difference. I think the important thing to remember is that our debt, and by implication our deficit, is also where our savings are. The only president in the history of the United States who paid off the national debt was Andrew Jackson, and he did it back in 1836. And what that did was it produced the deepest depression, arguably, the longest lasting one in American history. It lasted longer than the Great Depression. And it was a terrible, terrible economic crisis. And the reason why was because people couldn't buy treasuries. The government issues treasuries and you and I can buy them. And in fact, you can buy them directly from the federal government. And large investors can buy them. Other countries can buy them. And it's a safe place to put your money. In fact, it's literally the safest place in the world to put your money because it's protected by the full faith and credit of the United States. So back in the day, back in the 70s and early 80s, there was all this hysteria. We had a national debt when Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981 of $800 billion. And there was this concern that if our debt ever hit $1 trillion, that nobody would have faith in the government anymore. They'd say, yeah, America's too in debt for anything, and therefore everybody would flee and they'd sell their treasuries and it would crash the economy. It'd be the end of the world. And Reagan took our debt by, because he cut taxes on rich people from 74% down to 28%. He took our national debt from $800 billion when he came into office to $2.4 trillion when he left. He tripled the national debt. And then, of course, George W. Bush added another $4 or $5 trillion to the debt with his wars and with his tax cut. And then Donald Trump added another $7 trillion to the debt with his tax cuts and the pandemic. And it appears that it hasn't really had any effect. And the question is, how far can the debt go before it really starts hurting the government? Japan's national debt has been more than 200% of GDP, which would be about $45 trillion if it was the U.S. for at least 3 decades, as long as I can remember. And it doesn't seem to have hurt Japan at all. Mostly what you find, and this is probably why it's in the Houston newspaper, Briscoe, what you find is that these right-wing libertarian billionaires who don't want to pay any more taxes and don't want their tax dollars, federal money, being used to support the wealth of the Commonwealth. They don't want, food stamps. They don't want Medicare. They don't want Social Security. They don't want any kind of programs that help anybody. They're the ones who yell and scream about the debt, saying it's going to be a disaster. Oh my God, by way of trying to force cuts in domestic spending. They never use this argument, by the way, to cut the Pentagon budget, which is totally weird. But then they think that the Pentagon is the only legitimate function of government. So I'm frankly not concerned about it, Briscoe.
Okay, so is it not kind of disturbing if this is what's motivating the anti-McCarthy faction, and they're getting some concessions that are going to result in, severe cuts? Is this not kind of disturbing? I mean,
well, it means that what they're going to do is they're going to use the debt as the excuse to cut spending on social programs, which they've been doing since the Reagan administration. And, every single time the Republicans have any power, or Democrats have power and Republicans can yell and scream and obstruct, that's what they do. And so that's where they're going to go with it. And yes, that is troubling. Briscoe, thanks for the call. It was great. We'll be right back. We're hitting the top of the hour. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the Hartmann Report. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. All out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We take life back!
Our book today is The Poisoned City, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy by Anna Clark. This is from the prologue. On a hot day in the summer of 2014 in the Civic Park neighborhood in the Civic Park neighborhood where Pastor R. Sherman McCathern preached in Flint, Michigan, water rushed out of a couple of fire hydrants. Puddles formed on the dry grass and splashed the skin of the delighted kids who ran through it. But the spray looked strange. The water was coming out dark as coffee for hours, McCathern remembered. The shock of it caught in his throat. Something is wrong here. Something had been wrong for months. That spring, Flint, under the direction of state officials, turned off the darkening water that it had relied on for the drinking water that it had relied on for nearly 50 years. The city planned to join a new regional system called the Carignan Water Authority, and while it waited for the KWA to be built, it began bringing in its water from the Flint River. McCathern didn't pay much attention to the politicking around all this. He had enough to worry about with his busy parish. But after the switch, many of his neighbors grew alarmed at the water that flowed from their kitchen faucets and shower heads. They packed public meetings, wrote questioning letters, and protested at City Hall. They filled clear plastic bottles in their taps to show how the water looked brown or orange and sometimes had particulates floating in it. Showering seemed to be connected with skin rashes and hair loss. The water smelled foul. A sip of it put the taste of a cold metal coin on your tongue. But the authorities said everything was all right and you could drink it, so people did, McCathern said later. Residents were advised to run their faucets for a few minutes before using the water to get a clean flow. But as the months went by, the city plant tinkered with treatment and issued a few boil water advisories. State environmental officials said again and again that there was nothing to worry about. The water was just fine. Whatever their senses told them, whatever the whispers around town, whatever Flint's troubled history with powerful institutions telling them what was best for them, this wasn't actually hard for people like McCathern to believe. Public water systems are one of this country's most heroic accomplishments, a feat so successful that it's almost invisible. By making it a commonplace for clean water to be delivered to homes, businesses, and schools, we have saved untold lives from what today sound like antiquated diseases in a Charles Dickens novel: cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever. Here in Flint, it was instrumental in turning General Motors, founded in 1908 in Vehicle City, as the town was known, into a global economic giant. The advancing underground network of pipes defined the growing city and its metropolitan region, which boasted of being home to one of the strongest middle classes in the entire United States. McCathern is a tall, bald man with a thin mustache and a scratchy rasp in his baritone voice. At the time of the water switch, he had led the non-denominational Joy Tabernacle Church for about 15 years. It was founded in the YMCA in downtown Flint, where it held baptisms in the swimming pool. But in 2009, it made a home in Civic Park, where a Presbyterian church closed after 85 years and gave its sanctuary over to the young and hopeful congregation. By then, Civic Park, one of America's oldest subdivisions, was a desert of deserted, historically significant homes, the pastor said. Built between 1917 and 1919 by General Motors and DuPont and Company, along curving tree-lined boulevards, the tidy houses were designed for Flint's auto workers and their families. But over the years, the neighborhood was blighted by vacancy. Empty 2 stories with lurching front porches and crumbling roofs sat alongside crisply painted homes where Flint residents, they sometimes call themselves Flintoids or Flintstones, still live their lives. When the sound of gunshots on the street outside interrupted services, McCathern gave a nod to the church musicians, urging them to play louder. Some called Joy Tabernacle a thug church, he said, but McCathern saw the good. The young men filling his pews built a proud society, if not by getting their names on the honor roll, then by tagging their names with spray paint. In the end, people just want to be seen. The ghosts of the past went well beyond Civic Park. Between General Motors and the United Auto Workers, the city had been a flourishing hub for American innovation. There were more than 100 different manufacturing establishments in town. 10 of them employed at least 1,000 people each. And they not only made automobiles, but paints, varnishes, tools, dyes, cotton, textiles, and a wealth of other products. Flint had one of the highest per capita incomes in the entire nation. And despite being severely segregated, it was a magnet for African-American migrants from the South. When Vice President Hubert Humphrey stopped by during the campaign for the 1964 presidential election, he praised Flint for, quote, zooming ahead with unbelievable growth and progress. Workers earned wages that are very good, Humphrey said, and, quote, because of the great labor management program in the community over many years, there has been a constant rise in the standard of living, end quote. Away from the assembly lines and the executive suites, the people of Flint felt that the city just shouldn't be a place to work. It should also be a place to thrive. Charles Stewart Mott, an auto pioneer who became GM's single largest stockholder and three-term mayor, created a nationally renowned community schools program that provided education, skills-building workshops, and social influence and social services. The book, The Poison City.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the third hour of our program. The voting is continuing now on the fifth ballot. And once again, Mr. Donalds has now 6 votes. Kevin McCarthy, 35. Jeffries, 47. But 6 votes means no Kevin. Lauren Boebert just gave a little speech in the House talking about how just because Donald Trump says we should vote for Kevin doesn't mean we should do it. And there were literally gasps in the House. Republicans going, oh, can't believe she said that. She's going all in on the crazy, I guess. I wanted to talk with you in this hour about 2 things. The first being Putin's red lines, and the second being Pete Buttigieg and what the future of neoliberalism is. And let me get to Putin's red lines first. Nigel Gould Davies wrote an op-ed in the New York Times on the 1st of the year, January 1st. It was a guest essay. It was titled, Putin Has No Red Lines. And if you're not familiar with Nigel Gould Davies, he's a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's well-respected, highly regarded international policy expert. And he starts out by asking, what are Putin's red lines in terms of this war in Ukraine? What can we do that will provoke a response from him that we would not want, like using nuclear weapons? And he then immediately says, that's the wrong question to ask. And he says in fact, we shouldn't even be thinking in terms of red lines because there's pretty much no such thing. First off, red lines are negotiating tools. They are not lines drawn in the sand or whatever. In fact, the phrase he uses is red lines are actually more often red herrings. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he mentions this, Khrushchev said, if you try to stop us from putting our missiles in Cuba, since you've got missiles in Turkey, you've got missiles right on our border. We have a right to have missiles on your border. If you try to stop us from putting missiles in Cuba, we'll start a nuclear war over this. We will attack you. And John Kennedy called him up and said, cool. You will be destroying yourself. But if that's what you want to do, we're here. We're ready for it. We're not going to let you put those missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev backed down because it wasn't really a red line. It was a bluff. When Barack Obama, when he was president, and he said if the Russians or the Syrians use chemical weapons against their own people, against the Syrian people, that would be a red line that would provoke a quote, enormous consequences, was the phrase that Obama used. And then, sure enough, the Russians and the Syrians used poison gas against Syrian civilians, and we did nothing. We didn't respond. When we said that if the Taliban gets back into Kabul, if they try to take part of Kabul, that will be, that'll provoke a huge response, and yet suddenly it wasn't a red line for us anymore. So he says, in truth, red lines are nearly always soft, variable, and contingent. He says the second flaw of red line orthodoxy is that you have to take into account both the costs of escalation and the benefits. And then he notes, and there are, the benefit to ending the war in Ukraine is substantial to the world. I mean, literally people are starving around the world right now because Ukrainian food, Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world, and with regard to wheat, that food is not being exported, or much of it is not being exported. So what do we do? Well, he's saying that, our concerns about Russian red lines, I'll just quote, he says, concerns about Russia's red lines are driven, above all, by the fear that Russia might resort to nuclear escalation. The West should avert this by deterring Russia rather than by restraining itself or pressuring Ukraine to be restrained. And also, we should be communicating to Russia the certainty of severe consequences should they use nuclear weapons. And those consequences would not be nuclear retaliation. Those consequences would be economic, that we would basically destroy their country economically. He says the West should now aim to persuade Mr. Putin that withdrawing his forces from Ukraine is less perilous than fighting. He will be likely to do so if he understands that a long war threatens his regime by fatally weakening domestic cohesion or by escalating out of control. And, he makes the point that the one thing that Putin wants is for his regime to survive, right? So he notes America should focus on three things. First, he says it should no longer declare that there are measures it will refrain from taking and weapon systems it will not provide to Ukraine. He says to signal unilateral restraint is to make an unforced concession. Worse, it emboldens Russia to probe for and try to impose further limits on U.S. action, making the war more, not less risky. Second, he says, with its partners, America must make it clear that time is working against Russia, not in its favor, as Putin apparently believes. And third, he says the West should make clear to a wide range of Russian audiences that it is safe to end the war by leaving Ukraine. An orderly withdrawal is unlikely to lead to regime change, let alone the breakup of Russia. Neither outcome is the official goal of Western policy. I read this and I thought, oh my God, this guy, I'm no expert on military strategy or foreign policy, but this makes so much sense to just say, no, you cannot attack another democracy. Yes, I get it that, you believe that they are actually your property and you own them, but you can't do that. And yes, I get it that we've been hypocrites and we've done the exact same thing ourselves in the past, but we're not doing that now. And we're not going to let you do this with a democracy. Seems like a good start. So that's number one. The second thing I wanted to share with you, and then I'll pick up your phone calls here. I have been pondering this since I started about a year and a half ago. I started writing my last book, I think it's the 7th or 8th book in the series, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, How Reaganism Gutted America and How to Restore Its Greatness. And I think this is one of the most important books I've ever written. And in this book, my new book on neoliberalism, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, I lay out how neoliberalism came about in the United States, how it was embraced by the Republican Party, how, by Ronald Reagan in 1981, how it then became to be embraced by the Democratic Party in 1992 by Bill Clinton, and the damage that it has done in those 40 years to this country. And I wrap the book up, and I also talk about how, we imposed neoliberalism on Russia, and, it brought us Putin. We imposed neoliberalism on Chile, it brought us Pinochet, et cetera, the damage it's done around the world, and how China rejected neoliberalism in the early 90s. When they had an opportunity to embrace it, they said, no, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to go with Alexander Hamilton's American plan, only we're going to do a Chinese version of it. And thus, they became the second largest economy in the world. But the question in my mind has been, and I talk about this in the last chapter of The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, is when is the Democratic Party going to fully repudiate neoliberalism? Neoliberalism being that political economic model that says that free markets are everything, therefore corporations should be free or even incentivized to move their manufacturing offshore. You know, Donald Trump, his $1.7 trillion tax cut included a provision that said that if an American manufacturer moved a factory to Mexico, they got a tax break for doing that. You know, in other words, this, you know, Trump, of course, was a neoliberal. This is the essence of neoliberalism, is, you know, so-called free trade, gutting the social safety net, you know, all these things that are basically historically Reaganism. Reaganism and neoliberalism are the same thing. And so my question, and the question I've been asking myself, and we've been talking about on this program now for several years, is when will the Democratic Party kind of more or less officially repudiate neoliberalism? And I just wanted to share with you a quote from Pete Buttigieg. I mentioned this yesterday, I didn't have the quote, that in my mind, and I realize, you know, David Sirota over at The Lever is just trash-talking Buttigieg like there's no tomorrow, accusing him of still being a neoliberal. And notwithstanding that, and I get that, and I don't disagree that Buttigieg should have done a whole lot more with the airlines than he did early on, and probably should be doing more with them right now than he is. But nonetheless, this is a quote from Pete Buttigieg that I think is fascinating. And this is recent. This is from a piece in The Guardian, an interview that The Guardian conducted on December 31st, or they published it on December 31st. He said, and I quote, "The beginning of the Reagan era brought about a vicious cycle of public trust, where resources were stripped away from the government. It became harder for government to deliver for people, and then those policy failures reduced trust in government, which made people more reluctant to trust their taxpayer dollars to government, which meant even fewer resources and even worse results. The cycle of disinvestment has been accumulating for essentially my entire lifetime, and part of what's so exciting about this moment is a chance to reestablish public trust by making big investments to get big results, to build public confidence in the things we can do together through good public policy and good public investment." End of quote. That sounds to me like Buttigieg declaring, if not the end of neoliberalism, at least that he and his friends and you know, people in the Democratic Party are figuring its time has passed. It's time to phase this stuff out. So what say you? What do you think about this? By the way, the vote is continuing to, you know, and Daniels again has gotten more votes than, yeah, he's up to 11. Thank you, Nate. Up to 11 votes. So here we go. You know, McCarthy's in trouble still. Ha!
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Ted Lieu went to the floor of the House yesterday with a bag of popcorn. You know, the congressman from California. It was the perfect metaphor. We'll be right back. And welcome back. And picking up your phone calls here, James in Spokane, Washington. Hey, James, what's on your mind today?
That's cool.
James, you are on the air.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
James, you are on the air. Can you hear me?
Thank you. I'm sorry. I got a utility emergency going on at the house. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. Sure. You want me to put you on hold, or you can talk now?
No, I'm good. Concerning the Bitcoin, and you touched on it briefly, my understanding is that heavy consumption energy, I think at this point, supposedly generating a Bitcoin is taking as much energy as a small nation, I believe, and, you know, to take that for what it's worth. And each one even more so. So, I mean, the exponential growth, even if energy becomes cheaper, so wasteful, Tom, you know what I mean?
And most of that energy is being generated by fossil fuels.
Well, if you transition, waste is pollution.
Yep.
Any waste is pollution.
Yep.
So, you know, it's not even paper.
Yeah. No, I agree. I am not a fan of Bitcoin. I view it as an environmental harm. generally speaking. I realize there's a Bitcoin mining operation in Iceland that's running on thermal power, but you know, arguably that geothermal power could be used for other things. But yeah, I'm with you, James. James,
correct me if I'm wrong, Tom. The gold and silver is mandated by the Constitution, isn't it?
No, it's not. It says that the Constitution says that it's in Article 1, Section 8, says that Congress has the authority, has the right to authorize the printing and coining of currency. And interestingly, the Treasury Department issues our coins, and they are actual currency of the U.S. government. And the Federal Reserve Bank, or the Federal Reserve, issues our paper money, and that is not the currency of the U.S. government. That's the currency of the Federal Reserve. And they are different, actually, which is why some of the modern monetary theory people are saying the Treasury could issue a single platinum coin, and it doesn't even need to be platinum, it could be anything, but you know, they think platinum would be kind of elegant. Issue a single platinum coin and give it a value of $1 trillion, or issue 20 of them, and then hand those off to the Treasury. They have the mint produce them, hand them to the Treasury, put them on deposit, and wipe out the national debt.
Faith in empire in decline, though, you know.
Yeah, I know. Nobody's willing to, so far, nobody who is, serious, to the best of my knowledge, has taken that on. But it is an interesting idea, you know, because they couldn't issue it as currency because that would require the Fed to do it. And the Fed has been expanding and collapsing our money supply in the trillions. I mean, they raised. They put into currency an additional well over $10 trillion back in the crash of 2008, 2009. My recollection is it was over 20 trillion, but that just seems fantastic to me, and maybe I'm remembering it wrong.
That was the birth date of Bitcoin, too, maybe not coincidentally.
Yeah, could be.
A lot of money floating around at that time had to be reinvested.
That's an interesting point. Although, again, I think that the main value of Bitcoin, or benefit of Bitcoin, or whatever, the main use for Bitcoin is illicit interactions and transactions. So,
amen to that. Yeah. Black market is huge.
There you go. James, thanks a lot for the call. Yeah, the black market is literally a multi-trillion-dollar market. So 22 minutes past the hour. I will be picking up your phone calls after this. Whatever's on your mind, we can talk about. Stick around. We'll be right back. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. Now, you would think that anything that saves 50,000 American lives every year and saves the nation $600 billion every year would be something that there'd be an absolute political consensus about. Everybody would be saying, oh, 50,000 lives? Are you kidding? I could be one of those lives. $600 billion a year. Imagine what you could do with that. The impact you could have on poverty and education and health and everything else. Well, it turns out there's a new study that was published in the peer-reviewed publication GeoHealth, done by University of Madison, Wisconsin researchers. And they looked at this issue of the consequence of burning fossil fuels, both for transportation and generating electricity, and found that if we simply ended fossil fuels and went with clean sources of electricity, we would literally save 50,000 lives a year and save $608 billion a year. There's a whole video about it over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. 23 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls. David in San Francisco. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
Oh, howdy, Tom. Yeah, a couple of different things. I was interested in the January 6th, but as you've been talking about economic policy, there's, specie was supposed to be this idea, you got fiat currencies and you got specie, and gold is specie and fiat is kind of like the education level of an entire nation.
Right. Specie is currency that also has intrinsic value, and fiat currency is currency that does not have intrinsic value. If my recollection of high school civics is correct. Correct me if I'm wrong, David.
Well, that's where you had another caller who was talking about that money should be based upon love, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to look at fiat as if a nation has an educated population without currency, it's got a whole bunch of educated people, but they don't have enough capital to get anything done. And so with their cleverness, they create a method of exchange. And so that would be a system where your reputation would be your means of exchange. If you do a good job at plumbing, if you do a good job at talk show hosts, if you do a good job at shoe shining, at making sure that the books are balanced, whatever, your reputation is your means of exchange. And quite often, and this is coming up with the Bitcoin, it's coming up with just the basic system of money. If a thief steals a vast amount of money, he basically is able to steal the reputations of people who were hard workers, and they put it in a bank, and then that bank got robbed. Is the reputation of all of the people lost because a bank robber comes in and steals the bank? So nowadays, we have an opportunity to get into a reputation economy, and that's with climate change, and that's with COVID, and that's with a number of these crises, that if a person provides steady leadership during a crisis, they're basically setting up their reputation for the future. And so it comes to that issue of whether it's a love economy, some sort of a thing where if you're a good neighbor, your actions are going to be basically giving stability to the neighborhood, and that in a crisis especially becomes a real stability. I hear the music. The last thing I was going to raise, you were talking about Trump, and he knew that he was going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
In the first episodes of the January 6th thing, they said September of 2020. But if you study Ginny Thomas's emails with the Council on National Policy...
David, we're out of time. I'm sorry.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
I really wanted to hear the last half of that sentence, too. We'll be back. It's 27 minutes past the hour. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Criminology on Trump by Greg Barak. This is from the introduction. Criminology on Trump is about family business, habitual lawlessness, and the struggle for economic and political power. The central character, Donald Trump, is a con artist, a master gaslighter, and a shrewd racketeer. It is the story of how the Houdini of white-collar crime and the founder and CEO of the Trump Organization operated a criminal enterprise from within an incorporated organization beginning in 1980 and continuing up to and from within the bowels of the White House for 4 years. At the same time, it's the history of the causation of the social, psychological, and physical harms connected to the Donald and his associates before, during, and after the presidency. This book is also an account of the activities that Donald Trump pursued in order to obtain the power of Commander-in-Chief of the United States, what he then did with that power of the bully pulpit once he achieved it, and finally the lengths to which he would go to keep from losing that power. Lastly, this is the story of what many elected and appointed politicos did or did not do to acquire or to forfeit their individual shares of Trumpian power. This overall analysis of the underside of the rule of law begs the question, had the Donald not become the 45th president of the United States, would he, his children, or the Trump Organization have found themselves formal defendants and legal adversaries of the people of the state of New York? My answer unequivocally would have been no way. As of January 6, 2022, the question remains open as to whether Donald Trump, as the former president, or any of his family members will ever be indicted and prosecuted for criminal tax fraud and the other felonies, along with the Trump Organization, Inc., and its CFO, Alan Weisselberg. From the point of view of newsmaking, lawlessness, and equal justice, much of the popular discourse surrounding Trump has to do with competing narratives. The most reverberating of these has been the dueling apocalyptic narratives traversing both old and new media platforms alike. One narrative has to do with witch hunts, hoaxes, fake news, global elites, and the deep state engaging in a myriad of underworld and otherworld conspiracies to bring down Trump. The other narrative has to do with saving the U.S. democracy from authoritarianism, recovering law and order from the damage, chaos, and trauma of Trump, and restoring American normalcy without all of that political insanity. While these two narratives capture the cultural conflict, the diverse groups of people at work here and the rival social movements of incompatible interests, desires, and visions, neither speaks to the fundamental structural conditions that generate the divisiveness between these two narratives. Without ever addressing these structural relationships, the two sides will remain at loggerheads for some time to come. The medium is always, as always, is still the message. And so far in the 21st century, social media is the medium. At the same time, the weaponizing of racism, misogyny, hate, fear, intimidation, and violence vis-a-vis social media is neither new nor unique to the United States. These socio-cultural expressions of the contradictions of patriarchy, neocolonialism, and capitalism have been around since the nation's inception. Today's Proud Boys are the contemporary versions of New England churchmen in the 1700s, the Klan riders of the 1800s, or the fervent followers of Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. Likewise, the anti-critical race theory politicians of today that do the bidding for white minority rule and racial discrimination are very much the same as John C. Calhoun fronting for the rich plantation owners during the antebellum South. The primary differences between the not-so-distant past of the last 75 years and the present have to do with the disbursements of the accumulation of capital. From post-World War II until around 1974, the United States experienced close to 3 decades of unparalleled upward social mobility, as well as a rapidly expanding middle class. However, since the mid-1970s to 2022, there's been a steady increase in economic inequality, a shrinking middle class, and downward social mobility for many. Thus, the contemporary bipartisan erosion of the liberal capitalist consensus in the United States is not the primary cause of our present democratic crisis, but it is rather symptomatic of a much broader problem that neither the Republicans, as a whole, nor most of the Democrats are willing to accept. The book, continuing, I'm referring to the inability of our bourgeois democratic system to resolve the contradictions of a political economy that promises the American dream to one and all and yet caters to the richest 1% and provides suitably for the upper 10%. In other words, our country's present-day conflicts over identity politics, government failures, neoliberal policies, right-wing intransigencies, and climate change not only predate Donald Trump and Trumpism, but they are all fundamentally driven by the unrelenting and expanding political economy of structural inequality. What makes this Trump book different from the others is that it is the only one grounded in the scientific study of crime and social control. Criminology focuses on the pathology of harmful acts and the cultural construction of both crime and punishment. The book is Criminology on Trump by Greg Barak. Greg Barak, by the way, is an expert in criminology, as you might guess. Share the Thom Hartmann program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann program. So Republicans all over the country are all hysterical about all the money that we're spending on welfare. You know, we just can't afford this stuff. And so, you know, let's look at it. How much money are we spending on welfare? Well, it turns out the average American taxpayer making $50,000 a year, which is actually a little above the average, but the average American taxpayer making 50 grand a year, out of that 50,000, $36 goes toward food stamps and $6 towards other safety net programs. But that average American taxpayer making 50 grand a year, $870 of their taxes goes to pay for corporate subsidies. $1,600 goes to offset corporate tax loopholes. $1,231 goes to offset losses from corporate overseas tax havens. And don't get me started on the tax loopholes that let billionaires only pay 3% income taxes. There's a whole video about this over at thomhartmann.com if you want to do a deep dive. Check it out. Welcome back. 35 minutes past the hour, and picking up your call. Oh, by the way, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, this, breaking news. She just said that she is open to, remember earlier I said that if the Democrats cut a deal with the Republicans, it won't be for specific legislation, it will be for process? That's exactly what she just said. She said, hey, if we could get some chairs. In other words, if they can agree on a compromise candidate, the Republicans and the Democrats, and presumably that compromise candidate would be a Republican, and in exchange for that, the Democrats can get to chair a couple of committees in the House. And the other thing that she mentioned, and again, I had mentioned this earlier too, is a promise not to blow up our country by refusing to raise the debt ceiling. That she could go along. She could vote for a Republican for House of Representatives. And she has been playing a surprisingly high-profile role recently in some of these apparent negotiations, or apparently playing this role. Just from all the indications we have. So, another interesting thing. All right, picking up your calls, George in Chicago. Hey, George, what's up?
Well, a Happy New Year to you and Louise and your family and everybody in the Thom Hartmann organization.
Thank you, George. Back at you.
You're welcome. Thank you, and hope it turns out to be a good year for all of us.
Yeah, me too.
One quick comment before I get to what I called about when you mentioned earlier about John Kennedy confronting Khrushchev or issuing an ultimatum or drawing a line in the sand, whatever it was. That was before anybody in the American political or military establishment knew that the Russians had snuck 50 or 60 tactical nuclear weapons into Cuba. And if Kennedy had listened to General Curtis Boom Boom LeMay and Maxwell Taylor and others and went with their plan to invade Cuba with 250,000 American troops, they would have turned the Caribbean into a boiling lake of dead Americans.
Yeah, you're right.
And that would have required a nuclear response on our part. Every Russian ship at sea would have been sunk. We would have hit Cuba with nuclear weapons, and war would have started in Europe. So we all owe a lot to John Kennedy. His instincts were correct.
Yep, you're absolutely right.
But you've been talking about currency matters today, and this is something that has interested me and puzzled me for quite some time. Every piece or item of American currency bears the phrase, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private." I'm holding a $10 Federal Reserve note in my hand. Mm-hmm. And I started noticing maybe as long as 15 or 20 years ago that you would see businesses who would say, "We don't accept any bills over $20. And I would ask them, "Do you believe what it says on this bill? If I had a 50 and you're not going to let me pay for my dinner with it?" No, you'll have to go elsewhere. And now I got an email a couple of days ago from a restaurant chain in Chicago that I patronize, and I'm on their loyalty points list, that in their drive-ups they will no longer be accepting cash, only credit cards. Now, we all know that the cashless economy is well on its way and is never going to go away, but this is a great benefit to law enforcement and corporations because they get all this information about every kind of spending you do, and it all goes into the great computer, and it's all interchanged from one to another.
Right.
But if you're just an average or low-income person who wants to live your own life, mind your own business, be frugal, and pay cash, you're screwed. So does this legend on our bills, does it mean anything? Why doesn't the Federal Reserve or the Treasury or the Justice Department enforce this and make businesses take cash?
This very question was a minor furor in the late 1990s on the right. And Limbaugh, in fact, was talking about it, which is why I remember it. And it had to do with somebody who had sued, as I recall, I mean, again, this is almost 30 years ago, somebody who had sued a store because for exactly what you're talking about, they wouldn't take cash or they wouldn't take a large bill. And basically the government refused to defend that position. They refused to prosecute the store. And so, you know, stores get away with it. Technically, it's illegal. You know, if the currency says it's legal tender, then and you're going to engage in commerce and you're licensed to do business, then you've got to accept it, to the best of my knowledge. But the reality is not quite there. With regard to the cashless society, one of the Scandinavian countries, and I just saw this yesterday, I think, in the Financial Times, has now achieved 100% cashless economy. Nobody takes cash any longer in that country. I don't recall if it was Finland or Sweden. It was one of the Scandinavian countries. And the consequence of that is that the black market economy, the criminal underground, the local mafia, is on the verge of being put out of business because they were the cash business and they would run legitimate businesses in order to launder their money. And, you know, they can't do any of that anymore. I get it that there's a total loss of privacy, that the corporations and government, presumably, if they wanted to buy the information from the corporations, can figure out absolutely everything you've done. But if the price of that, I mean, this is the trade-off that society has to debate, is it worth losing a certain level of privacy in exchange for, you know, eliminating organized crime, essentially, from your society?
Well, that's a good point. But as you mentioned earlier, very sophisticated organized criminals are using cryptocurrency. And there's also the dark web where all these kinds of underhanded evil transactions go on. So maybe becoming cashless isn't going to get rid of all of it.
No, it won't. And the article noted that as a caveat. But in terms of the retail organized, you know, criminal activity, it's taken a big hit. So, you know, it's a very interesting time, George, with the cryptocurrency, with the cashless society. And I agree with you. You know, the banks love it because they get to make a buck off basically everything that happens, which raises, you know, for Americans, raises the issue of should we take Bernie Sanders' advice and allow the post office to go into the no-fee banking business so that people who can't, you know, right now don't have enough money to open a checking account or have a debit card will be able to do that through the post office. Because banks don't want to service people who don't make a lot of money because it's just, you know, there's no money to be made on those people unless, you know, you get a lot of overdraft fees and things like that. And even then it becomes real problematic. So it's a large
well, you know,
topic
that's
without simple answers.
One of the services that's common in a lot of our peer countries where they have postal banks.
Yep.
But not here.
Yeah, when I lived in Germany in the 80s, I used to go to the post office to cash my checks. But Germany no longer does that, by the way. I'm pretty sure they stopped. Now it's all banks. That was back in the 80s, but good point. George, thank you for the call and thoughtful conversation. Grace in Midlothian, Virginia. Hey, Grace, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I'm just commenting the speakership issue here. I just want to say that the Democrats should not be bending over for a process the AOC has suggested, because we have 212 members. Why don't we ask certain centrist Republicans to join us, and in return we give them some, you know, ranking member or chairman, and we get to control the agenda, because we shouldn't trust any Republican at all, really. How many times have they lie and say one thing? Look at Mitch McConnell. You know, we shouldn't trust any of them. If they let George Santos to, you know, be sworn in, why would we trust any of them for anything?
We have had a two-party system in the United States, in reality since the John Adams administration, since 1796, and in a big way since the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800. And to the best of my knowledge, I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. In that entire time, and the House of Representatives has operated pretty much the same now as it always had, all the way back to that era. During that entire time, no House has ever been, there has never been a speaker who represented the party in the minority. So I don't think it's possible that the Democrats could convince the Republicans that they should go along with a Democratic speaker, even one Republican. It would be political suicide for any one Republican to go along with that. What the Democrats might be able to do is negotiate with the Republicans to accept a speaker, even Kevin McCarthy, who is willing to give in on a couple of key issues, like give some key committee positions to Democrats, or guarantee that all the committees will be 50-50 rather than one. Right now, the way it's probably going to be, if Kevin McCarthy had been able to become Speaker, the House Rules package that he was proposing was that every committee would have one more Republican than Democrat on it, so there would always be a Republican majority. Instead, make them 50-50, which would give the Democrats the power to block committees from doing things that Democrats might object to. That's pretty powerful stuff. I mean, there's some real power negotiations that can be had. It's not going to happen, though, until McCarthy or the Republicans in general have reached a point of essentially desperation. It's clear to McCarthy that his own party is not going to go along with him, and it's clear to everybody in the party that as long as these right-wing crazies, the Boeberts and Gateses of the world continue to sabotage their efforts, they're not going to win. And so, they're going to have to figure out how to go around that, the so-called Freedom Caucus. I don't know how it's going to play out.
I take your note, but I just thought that if we can trust them, that's the thing. If the Democrats say, okay, all right, well, we voted for you, let's say McCarthy, and then he go back on his promise. And what do we do?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time he's done that. But it would probably be the last time he'd get away with it. I don't think that the Democrats are going to...
But that's too late then, isn't it? Then they have the speaker, they control the agenda, and you get nothing back. It
might be, but that could also be political suicide. I mean, keep in mind, every member of the House is up for election every 2 years. And there's an election coming in another 23 months. And 22 months, and the Republicans are not unaware of that and how slim their majority is. So, I don't know. We'll see. Grace, thank you. Thank you for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
So, Kevin McCarthy lost another vote. Where is this going? Nobody knows. We'll be right back with your calls. And welcome back. Picking up your calls here. David in Venice Beach, California. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. First off, just Happy New Year. And like all your audience, just so grateful for you making it a Happy New Year for so many of us.
Thank you,
now
David.
For something like 15 years.
Yeah, 19. It'll be 20 years in March or April. And thank you for the acknowledgement and your kind New Year's wishes. I hope the year is a good one for you and your family too, David. So what's on your mind?
Thank you. What a voice in the wilderness, though, you've been. And may we be coming out of the wilderness in this year 2023.
Amen.
Hey, well, I just wanted to call because so inspired. I wish I could remember his name, give credit where credit is due. The caller who mentioned, let's just do love. And it just so fits with this discussion about cryptocurrency. I myself am an activist in LA. I've been working for some years, and we've had city currencies, local currencies. Cryptocurrency has kind of opened up a door. What if we had a form of currency that the only way you could earn something on it was to do something that was good for all 8 billion people on the planet? And what if we had a currency, a debit card, that the only things you could buy with it were things that had the love seal of approval that was good for all 8 billion of us.
You know,
I think that is a dream worth working on.
Yeah, you mentioned local currencies, and they operate on a philosophy that's not dissimilar from that. It's very congruent with that, David. When we lived in Vermont, they were just rolling out, or had just rolled out about maybe a year before we left Vermont, the Green Mountain bucks, as I recall, or maybe they were called Green Mountain dollars. Vermont is the Green Mountain state. And it was a local currency that could only be spent locally. And they'd gotten a bunch of banks to agree to accept these Green Mountain dollars and a bunch of local businesses. And the whole goal was, you couldn't spend these at Walmart. You couldn't spend them at McDonald's. You couldn't spend them at any chain business where the money, every night they'd push a button and at McDonald's all the money goes to Chicago, or at Walmart all the money goes to Bentonville, Arkansas. You could only spend those Green Mountain dollars at stores that were local, and those stores then would
build up the community.
Exactly.
Build up people.
Exactly, because it used to be back, oh geez, it's been a long time since I wrote about this. It's been at least 20 years since I wrote about this, so I'm not sure of my statistics, but my recollection is that back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the velocity of, or the stickiness of money within a local economy was substantial. In other words, if you spent $1 into the local Montpelier, Vermont economy, that dollar would circulate locally as little bits of it are chewed away and sent off to other places as local vendors have to buy product from outside the city.
Again,
it would take time.
It was just to help people.
Right, but then what had happened by the late 90s was that, largely because of Walmart and McDonald's, because of these chain businesses, was that the velocity with which currency would leave the local economy had gone up dramatically. So instead of that dollar circulating for weeks, it would just circulate for a few days, or maybe even in some cases a few hours.
I think it'd be amazing to have a wallet that you could put money in that was serving humanity.
Yeah, I agree. David, thank you. Thank you for the call. And thanks for listening to KBCS. We'll be right back. It's 51 minutes past the hour, or coming up on 9 minutes before or it is 9 minutes before the hour. Back with your calls right after this. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertising. To us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio, and tag you're it. Joe Biden has done a lot. He signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law. He announced targeted student debt relief plan. He issued 2 executive orders to safeguard access to reproductive health care. He signed the CHIPS and Science Act into law. He signed the PACT Act into law for our veterans. We have historically low unemployment rates, lower than we've had since the 1960s. He helped our economy recover through the American Rescue Plan. He confirmed our first black justice to the Supreme Court, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. He expanded the NATO alliance. He rallied our allies in support of Ukraine. He's made once-in-a-generation infrastructure investments. We have record enrollment in the Affordable Care Act. More Americans have health care now than ever before, over the objections of the Republicans, I might add. Historic funding for HBCUs, the historically black college and universities. He reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act. I mean, just step by step, there has been so much that has been accomplished. In the face of all this Republican obstruction, there's a video with the complete list over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. Picking up your calls here. Nikki in Chicago. Hey, Nikki, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. You were talking about the deficit previously that hadn't been paid off since 1823 or something.
Yeah, in the 1830s.
My question for you is, what was the measure that Clinton and Gore, and actually I think historically Democrats across the board, is it the debt ceiling that they lower, or is it something that they did during the presidency of Bill Clinton brought down the debt?
Yeah,
different from the
Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, to the best of my knowledge, Obama may have also, were the only presidents since the Reagan administration, and maybe even going back way before that, to have presented balanced budgets. And in fact, they had one of Clinton's budgets was a surplus budget. So it actually reduced the national debt. That's how you reduce the national debt. You bring in more on taxes than you spend on everything you spend money on. And
Isn't it that different from the deficit?
Well, that is the deficit. The deficit is the annual difference between what you bring in and what you spend out. And if the deficit is negative, it adds to the national debt, which is the accumulation of all the deficits. And if the deficit, or if the balance between what you bring in and what you spend is positive, then it reduces the national debt. And Clinton reduced the national debt. I remember that clearly. I know that Jimmy Carter proposed a balanced budget that would have reduced the national debt. I don't recall if it passed that way or not. I'd have to go back and look. And I believe that Obama proposed a balanced budget at least once, and I don't recall if it passed or not either. The one I'm sure of is Clinton. I remember that. I remember when it happened, thinking, oh, my God.
I think you're right about Jimmy Carter, because I remember he did a 10% cut to defense spending, and it had a huge effect on the economy.
That might have been it. I don't remember that, the details of that era that well, but yep. So, Nikki, thank you for the call. Happy New Year. William in Bremerton, Washington. William, we have less than a minute. You got a quick one? William? Okay, Alfredo in Mountain View, California. We have a lot less than a minute. You got a quick one?
Yeah, Tom, when Trump was president, he increased taxes on the middle class and the poor and gave huge tax breaks to the billionaires.
That's right.
Why is it that the Democrats didn't repeal the Trump tax? That's something that I'm always baffled about, and I'll take my answer off the air.
It is self-repealing, is my understanding. It was passed through reconciliation, which means it can't last more than 10 years. And Trump had also built into it that the tax cuts on average working people start expiring this year. So this year, if you're making under a couple $100,000 a year, your taxes will go up as a result of that law that Trump passed. And yeah, why you know what the Democrats haven't been able to do anything about that? I don't know. I don't have an easy or glib answer for you on that one. I'm sorry, Alfredo. Thanks so much for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Never was, wasn't intended to be. Demos means people. That's you and me, right? So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's a daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox, no ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free Our Daily Show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. All out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.